Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where curiosity lowers its voice, the world grows quiet, and even the wildest places on Earth can be explored from the calm safety of a warm room. Tonight, we are sailing toward one of the most feared names in maritime history. Not a kingdom, not a city, not a battlefield, but a point of rock and water at the lower edge of South America, a place where sailors once tightened their coats, checked the sky, and hoped the sea was in a generous mood. Tonight's journey is about Cape Horn, and why sailors have feared these waters for centuries. Cape Horn is one of those names that sounds small until you understand what it means. It is only a cape after all, a headland, a rocky point, a place where land ends and water begins. But some places become much larger than their shape on a map. Some places gather weather, memory, danger, and story around them until the name itself starts to feel heavy. Cape Horn is like that. Say it slowly and you can almost hear the creak of old wooden ships, the snap of frozen sails, and the low warning sound of waves rolling in from a very long distance. Before we go any farther, I'd love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Are you somewhere warm, with a window cracked open, and the evening air drifting in? Or are you tucked away from rain, snow, or a stubborn little wind that keeps tapping at the glass like it has important news? And if you feel like sharing, what is the weather doing where you are right now? It seems fitting to ask, because this is a story about weather that refused to behave, a story about wind with no patience, water with no manners, and sailors who learned that the ocean, when it wants to, can turn a simple route into an exam that nobody feels ready to take. If you find this kind of slow voyage soothing, or if you enjoy wandering through geography, history and science without anyone shouting over dramatic music, I'd be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed. It helps this quiet little corner reach others who might also enjoy learning something strange and interesting before sleep. And don't worry, we're not actually rounding Cape Horn tonight. No one here needs to climb a mast in freezing rain, argue with a compass, or eat a biscuit that has been damp since Tuesday. We can stay right where we are, comfortable and dry, while the old sea stories do the hard work. So settle in, let your shoulders loosen, let the day step back a little. Tonight, we're going to the place where the Atlantic and Pacific do not so much meet politely as collide in a cold, restless argument. We're going to the far south, past the easier routes, past the warm trade winds, past the neat blue lines on a classroom globe, down to the narrow end of the Americas, where sailors once looked at the horizon and knew they were approaching a test. For a long time, Cape Horn was not just a landmark, it was a gate. To sail from the Atlantic to the Pacific, or from Europe toward the west coast of the Americas, ships often had to pass this way before the Panama Canal changed global travel in the early 20th century. On a map, the idea looks simple enough. You come down one side of South America, curve around the bottom, and go up the other side. A neat little turn, almost polite. The sort of thing a line of ink can do in half a second. But ships are not ink, and oceans do not care how tidy a route looks on paper. For the sailors who came before engines, satellites, radar, accurate forecasts, and warm waterproof gear, rounding Cape Horn meant entering a world of waiting, watching, and enduring. Their ships were powered by wind, which was useful when it helped, and deeply inconvenient when it did not. Their hulls were built of wood or iron, their sails were cloth, their ropes grew stiff with salt and cold, and their knowledge came from experience, instruments, and the difficult habit of surviving yesterday. The sea did not send them notifications. It did not explain itself. A cloud line, a falling barometer, a strange swell under the hull, a change in the cry of the wind. These were the signs. Read them correctly and you might prepare in time. Miss them, and Cape Horn might introduce itself with rather more force than anyone had requested. The fear of Cape Horn begins with its position. It lies very far south at the lower end of South America near the Drake Passage, the wide stretch of water between Cape Horn and Antarctica. And that matters because the Southern Ocean is not like most oceans. Around much of the planet, continents interrupt the movement of wind and water. Land gets in the way. Mountains, forests, deserts, cities and coastlines break things up. But in the far southern latitudes, the winds can sweep around the world with very little land to stop them. They travel across huge distances of open water, gathering strength, building waves, and arriving with the confidence of a guest who has never once been asked to take off muddy boots at the door. These winds have names that sound as if sailors invented them after several bad nights. The roaring 40s, the furious 50s, the screaming 60s. They refer to bands of latitude in the southern hemisphere where strong westerly winds are common. Cape Horn sits deep in this rough southern zone, where the weather can be severe and change quickly. A sailor approaching the Horn was not just dealing with a storm here or there, they were entering a region where the general mood of the atmosphere was already suspicious. And then there is the shape of the world itself. South America tapers down toward the Horn, while Antarctica lies far to the south. Between them, the Drake Passage forms a broad but powerful corridor for wind and current. It is not a narrow hallway in the ordinary sense, but compared with the open sweep of the Southern Ocean, it is a place where movement becomes focused. Water is driven through, air moves across, weather systems pass by with very little interest in human schedules. If the sea had a busy doorway, this would be one of them, and sailors, being practical people, have never been fond of standing in a busy doorway while carrying something fragile such as a ship. The waves near Cape Horn are another reason the name has carried so much dread. In many parts of the ocean, waves rise and fall with a kind of pattern that, while uncomfortable, can at least be understood. Around the Horn, waves have room to grow across great distances. The technical word for that distance is fetch, which sounds almost friendly, as if the sea is a dog bringing back a stick. In practice, it means wind blowing over open water for long stretches, pushing the surface again and again until large swells form. By the time those swells reach the waters near Cape Horn, they can be enormous. But large waves alone are not the whole problem. A long, rolling swell can be intimidating, but a skilled ship may ride it if conditions are steady. The real trouble comes when waves become steep, confused, or broken by opposing winds and currents. Around Cape Horn, this can happen often. The ocean floor changes, currents run hard, storm systems move through. Wind can hit from one direction while swell arrives from another. Instead of a simple rise and fall, the sea can become a moving field of ridges, holes, and walls. Imagine trying to carry a tray of tea across a room while the floor keeps lifting itself into furniture. Now imagine the tea is your entire ship. The room is freezing, and the furniture weighs several thousand tons. It is not ideal. Cold adds its own quiet danger. Cold water is not merely uncomfortable, it is unforgiving. A sailor washed overboard in warm seas might still have a chance if the crew reacts quickly. In the cold waters near the Horn, time becomes brutally short. Hands lose feeling, muscles weaken, thought slows. Even aboard the ship, cold could make work harder. Wet clothes stayed wet, ropes became stiff, decks became slick. Fingers that needed to tie knots, reef sails, grip rails, and haul lines had to do delicate tasks while numb and tired. The sea did not need to be dramatic every moment to be dangerous. Sometimes it only needed to be cold, wet, and patient. Fog and poor visibility could make matters worse. A ship needs sea room, especially in bad weather. It needs space to move, turn, run before the wind, or keep clear of land. But Cape Horn is not just open water. There are islands, rocks, shoals, and hard coastlines in the region. In fog, rain, darkness, or spray, the difference between safe water and disaster could become very small. Modern navigation has changed much of this, but for older sailors, land could be both salvation and threat. A sheltered cove might save a ship from a storm. Yet an unseen rock could tear open a hull before anyone had time to say something calm and nautical about it. The old fear of Cape Horn also came from how long the struggle could last. A storm in some places might pass, leaving a crew exhausted but relieved. Around the Horn, ships trying to sail against the prevailing wind could be pushed back again and again. Days could become weeks. A vessel might gain ground, lose it, try again and be driven off course. Sailors called it rounding the Horn, but the phrase sounds far too neat for what it often involved. It could mean fighting for every mile, changing sail in dangerous conditions, waiting for a shift in the wind, and hoping the ship, the crew and the supplies all lasted a little longer. For sailing ships, this was especially hard when travelling from east to west, against the strong westerlies. A ship cannot simply point straight into the wind and go. It must work at angles, tacking back and forth, using the wind as best it can. In ordinary conditions, this is skillful and manageable. Near Cape Horn, with gales, waves, current and cold, it could become a contest of endurance. The ship would lean, climb, slam, shudder and fall off waves. Sails might tear, masts might strain, men might be thrown across decks. Meals, if they could be prepared at all, were unlikely to be elegant. This was not the sort of voyage where anyone complained that the garnish lacked imagination. And yet sailors went. That is one of the most interesting parts of the story. Cape Horn was feared, but it was also necessary. Before easier routes were available, trade, exploration, migration and ambition all pushed ships toward that hard southern passage. Goods had to move. Gold seekers wanted to reach California. Whalers, merchants, naval crews and adventurers all had reasons to face the Horn. The sea was dangerous, but the world on the other side was full of opportunity. So people took the risk, because human beings have always had a strange talent for looking at a dangerous place and saying, with varying levels of wisdom, yes, but what if we went through it? The sailors who survived Cape Horn did not treat it as a casual achievement. Rounding the Horn became a mark of experience. It separated those who had merely been to sea from those who had met one of the sea's sternest teachers. In maritime culture, there were traditions and signs of respect tied to it. A sailor who had rounded Cape Horn under sail carried a kind of reputation, not because he had defeated the ocean. No sensible sailor thinks that way for long. It was because he had endured a place where carelessness had no room, where luck mattered, and where skill had to work in freezing partnership with patience. There is also something about Cape Horn that speaks to the imagination, because it is placed at an edge. Humans are drawn to edges. The edge of a continent, the edge of a storm, the edge of what a person can stand. Cape Horn sits at the edge of maps and weather systems and old trade routes. It is a real place, with coordinates, rocks, birds, rain and waves. But it also became a symbol of the difficult passage, the moment in a journey when comfort is gone, confidence is tested, and the only way forward is through. Sailors feared it because it could kill them. They remembered it because surviving it meant something. From a safe chair, with perhaps a blanket nearby and no need to check whether the mainsail is about to split, it can be easy to romanticize such places. We picture the tall ship under storm clouds, the captain at the rail, the crew moving bravely through spray. And yes, there is drama there. There is courage too. But the reality was often less tidy. Fear at sea is not always a grand, cinematic feeling. Sometimes it's a tired man trying to tie a line with swollen hands. Sometimes it's a cook unable to keep the stove lit. Sometimes it's a young sailor hearing the timbers groan and wondering if that sound is normal. Sometimes it is the long silence after a wave has passed over the deck, when everyone waits to see who is still there. That is why Cape Horn deserves to be understood slowly, not just as a dangerous dot on a map, and not only as a legend sailors used to frighten newcomers, but as a meeting place of geography, weather, ocean physics, history and human nerve. Its danger was not caused by one thing. It came from many things stacking together. Strong winds, Large waves, cold water, sudden storms, difficult currents, ice drifting from the south, rocky coastlines, long distances from help, the limits of old, ships, the exhaustion of crews. One hazard is a problem, several hazards at once become a reputation, and reputations at sea are not built quickly. They are built by logbooks, wrecks, narrow escapes, repeated warnings, and stories told in harbours by people who no longer feel the need to exaggerate. A sailor who has truly been frightened by the sea does not always describe it loudly. Sometimes the quiet description is worse. The wind came up, the glass fell, the sea turned. We lost the boat. We nearly lost the mast. We could not get clear. Simple sentences can carry a great deal when the person saying them knows exactly what they mean. Tonight, as we move toward Cape Horn in story rather than in body, we will take the route carefully. We will look first at where this place is and why its position matters so much. We will examine the meeting of oceans and currents, the long reach of the Southern Ocean winds, and the waves that can rise with such force that even experienced sailors speak of them with respect. We will spend time with fog, cold, ice, and darkness, because danger is not always loud. We will listen for the older history too, the shipwrecks, the legends, the attempts, the failures, and the people who kept going because the world was large and the other coast was calling. For now, picture the map. Let your mind travel down the length of South America, past the heat of the tropics, past the long spine of the Andes, past forests, glaciers, channels, and islands. Keep going south until the land begins to break apart into fragments. The continent no longer feels like a solid wall. It becomes ragged, wet, and wind-cut. Then, beyond the last hard pieces of rock, there is Cape Horn facing the open water. Not tall in the way great mountains are tall, not wide in the way continents are wide, but placed in such a position that the whole lower ocean seems to know its name, and just offshore the water moves, the wind presses, the swell travels in from far away. Birds ride the air with more grace than any ship can manage. Clouds gather and thin. Rain comes sideways. A patch of light may appear for a moment and then vanish. Somewhere in that restless mixture, generations of sailors saw the truth very clearly. Cape Horn was not feared because sailors were easily frightened. It was feared because they understood enough about the sea to know when respect was not optional. So, with the room still calm around you, and the old southern waters beginning to take shape in the mind, we can ease closer to the edge of the map and look at the place itself. The rock, the route, the passage, and the reason this lonely point became one of the most famous sea marks on Earth. The first thing to understand about Cape Horn is that it is not a large place. That may feel strange considering the weight its name carries. We might expect something vast, perhaps a towering wall of cliffs or a great black mountain rising from the sea like a warning sign placed there by the planet itself. But Cape Horn is smaller and more specific than that. It is a headland on Hornos Island, a rocky point in southern Chile, set within the broken islands of Tierra del Fuego. On a map, it can look almost modest. A small mark near the bottom of South America, a label at the end of a continent, a dot with a famous name sitting quietly where the land gives up and the sea takes over. And yet that small point of land became one of the most important and feared sea marks in the world. Not because it was tall enough to dominate the horizon from a great distance, and not because it formed a comfortable harbour where sailors could rest. It became famous because of where it is placed. Geography, as it turns out, can be a very serious matter. Put a piece of rock in the wrong place, or perhaps the right place if you are a storm, and it can become a legend. Cape Horn lies near the southern end of the Tierra del Fuego archipelago. Tierra del Fuego itself is not a single neat piece of land, but a region of islands, channels, mountains, forests, and cold water at the far end of South America. The name means land of fire, which sounds rather dramatic for such a cold and wet part of the world. The name came from early European explorers who saw fires along the shore, lit by indigenous people who had lived in that region long before it appeared on European maps. There is something striking about that image. Fires glowing on the edge of a cold sea, seen from ships moving through unknown water. Human warmth at the end of the world, long before lighthouses, weather forecasts, or someone in a warm jacket saying, "This should make an excellent documentary." If you follow South America southward with your finger on a globe, the continent begins wide and confident. It has jungles, deserts, high mountains, broad rivers, and long coastlines. Then, as you move farther down, it narrows. The Andes continue like a great backbone. Patagonia stretches out with wind, steppe, ice, and open distance. Then the land starts to fragment. Instead of one clean coastline, there are islands and channels, inlets and straits, rocky shores and hidden passages. It feels less like the end of a continent and more like a continent slowly breaking into pieces before entering the sea. Cape Horn sits among those pieces. More precisely, it is on Hornos Island, part of the Hermit Islands group. This island is remote, exposed, and shaped by weather. There are no bustling streets there, no cosy seaside town with cafes, no cheerful harbour full of little boats painted red and blue. The modern human presence is small and practical, connected with navigation, protection, and the long history of people trying to understand or survive the waters nearby. There is a lighthouse and a Chilean naval presence in the area, but the place itself remains defined far more by wind, sea, rock, rain, and distance than by anything humans have built. That distance matters. Cape Horn is far from the great population centres of the world. It is far from the old European ports where so many voyages began. It is far from the warm trade routes that made sailing feel almost orderly by comparison. It sits at a high southern latitude, close enough to Antarctica's influence that the weather takes on a colder and harsher character. When sailors approached it, they were not just approaching a landmark. They were moving into a different zone of the planet, a zone where the normal comforts of lower latitudes fell away one by one. The Cape is often described as the southern tip of South America, and in a broad historical and navigational sense, that is how people have thought about it. But geography likes to be precise, sometimes inconveniently so. There are islands farther south, including the Diego Ramirez Islands, so Cape Horn is not the absolute southernmost piece of land associated with the continent. Still, for sailors and mapmakers, Cape Horn became the symbolic end. It was the point that mattered for the Great Passage around the bottom of South America. It was the name spoken in connection with danger, endurance, and arrival. If the world had a practical southern doorstep for sailing ships, this was it. Part of the reason Cape Horn became so important is that it lies at the northern side of the Drake Passage. The Drake Passage is the wide body of water between South America and Antarctica. Wide, in this case, does not mean gentle. It is wide enough to give the sea room to build and the wind room to work, but narrow enough in the great circulation of the Southern Ocean to focus enormous movement through one region. For sailors, this mattered more than almost anything. The water around Cape Horn is not dangerous simply because it is cold, or because it is far south, or because storms happen there. It is dangerous because several large forces meet in the same place. To the north, there is the broken land of Tierra del Fuego. To the south, across the Drake Passage, there is Antarctica, cold and massive, surrounded by ocean and ice. Between them, winds and currents move from west to east around the planet. Unlike in the Northern Hemisphere, where continents interrupt the flow, the Southern Ocean has a nearly open ring around Antarctica. That allows wind and water to travel long distances without hitting land. By the time these forces reach the region of Cape Horn, they have had plenty of space to gather strength. The result is not a polite sea with occasional bad moods. It is a place where roughness is part of the basic arrangement. This is why the position of Cape Horn on the map is so important. A map can make everything seem calm. Blue areas are water, brown or green areas are land. Lines show borders, names sit neatly beside the places they describe. There is no wind in a map unless someone has drawn arrows. There is no cold in a map. no spray hitting your face, no rope burning your hands, no ship dropping heavily into the trough between waves. But for sailors, a map is not just a picture, it is a warning system. It tells you where land blocks the wind, where channels narrow, where currents may run, where there is sea room, where there is none, and where the world has arranged itself in a way that may be troublesome. Cape Horn is troublesome by arrangement. It is near the meeting of the Atlantic and Pacific, but even that phrase can sound too simple. Oceans do not meet like two neighbours shaking hands over a garden fence. They connect through movement, pressure, temperature, salt, wind, and current. The waters around Cape Horn are part of a larger system that includes the Southern Ocean and the powerful flow around Antarctica. So when people say the Atlantic and Pacific meet near Cape Horn, they are speaking in the language of maps and routes. In the real water, the meeting is more complicated. It is less like a line and more like a restless mixing zone, with storms passing over it and currents moving beneath it. The old sailing routes made Cape Horn even more important. Before the Panama Canal, ships travelling between the Atlantic and Pacific often needed to go around the southern end of South America. There were other routes through channels, such as the Strait of Magellan, but those passages had their own difficulties, including narrow waters, tricky navigation, and unpredictable winds. Cape Horn offered open water, which sounds helpful until one remembers that open water can be very enthusiastic. For large sailing ships, especially those carrying cargo across the world, the Horn became part of the great route between oceans. This gave the Cape a strange double role. It was both a doorway and an obstacle. To pass it meant access to another ocean and another part of the world. For ships moving from Europe toward the Pacific coast of the Americas, or later along the routes of global trade, rounding the Horn could be a major turning point in the voyage. But the doorway was guarded by weather, and not the sort of guard who asks a few questions and waves you through, more the sort who throws buckets of freezing water at you while rearranging the floor. The shape of nearby land added to the challenge. Tierra del Fuego is full of channels, islands, and irregular coastlines. Some of these waters could offer shelter, but they could also trap or confuse a ship. In the days before modern navigation, knowing exactly where you were was not always simple. Latitude could be measured more reliably than longitude for much of maritime history, and clouds, storms, currents, and poor visibility could make observations difficult. A ship approaching land in bad weather might be closer to danger than the crew realised. Around Cape Horn, being uncertain by even a few miles could matter. Rock is very patient. It waits in the same place, and it does not move aside because a captain has had a difficult week. There is also the matter of false confidence. The name False Cape Horn exists for a reason. False Cape Horn, on Host Island to the northwest, could be mistaken for the real Cape. In poor visibility or under stress, mistakes of identification could happen, especially when sailors were tired, weather-beaten, and eager to believe they had reached a certain point. This is one of the quieter dangers of navigation. Not the giant wave, not the screaming wind, but the human mind wanting the coastline to be the one it hopes it is. A tired crew can look at land and see relief. The sea, unfortunately, has never been required to confirm anyone's optimism. For many sailors, Cape Horn was not only a place to pass, but a point to prove. Rounding it under sail became one of the great tests of seamanship. There were no shortcuts in the old sense. A ship had to manage wind, canvas, hull, crew, and course. It had to keep enough sail to make progress, but not so much that the rigging was overwhelmed. It had to avoid being driven too far south into colder and icier waters, but also avoid being pushed back or forced dangerously close to land. Every choice had weight. Reduce sail too late, and the ship might be damaged. Reduce too early, and the vessel might lose steerage or be driven where it did not want to go. The captain and crew were constantly balancing risk, speed, direction, and survival. That is part of why Cape Horn became a dividing line in sailors' minds. There are many difficult waters in the world. There are reefs that have wrecked ships, narrow straits that demand precision, tropical cyclones that can destroy fleets, and foggy banks where visibility vanishes. But Cape Horn combined danger with duration. It was not always a single event. It could be a long effort. A ship might struggle for days or weeks to make the turn, especially when trying to go westward against the prevailing winds. The Cape itself was only one point, but the experience of the Horn included the approach, the waiting, the attempts, the setbacks, and the hard miles after it. The land itself, when seen from the sea, does not need to look theatrical to be intimidating. A low, dark coast under heavy clouds can be more unsettling than a grand cliff in sunshine. Hornose Island has that far southern feeling of exposure. Vegetation is limited and shaped by the climate. The wider region includes subpolar forests, tundra, peatlands, and plant life adapted to cold, wet, windy conditions. It is not empty, though it may look severe from a ship. There are birds, marine animals, mosses, lichens, shrubs, and hardy ecosystems that have learned to live where the weather is not always polite. The landscape is not lifeless. It is simply not arranged for human comfort, which is a distinction people sometimes forget. In the modern world, Cape Horn is part of a protected area and is connected with conservation, as well as maritime history. Cabo de Hornos National Park and the wider Biosphere Reserve recognise the ecological importance of the region. That fact gives the place another layer. It is not just a symbol of shipwreck and storm, it is also a living environment with its own patterns and species. The same conditions that made sailors wary also help shape unique ecosystems. Persistent wind, cold rain, short growing seasons, and isolation all influence what can live there. Even the plants, in their quiet way, are part of the story of endurance. Still, for most of history, sailors thought less about ecology and more about getting through in one piece. Imagine approaching Cape Horn from the Atlantic side in a sailing ship. You've already been at sea for a long time. The crew is tired. The ship needs maintenance. The air has grown colder. The sun, when it appears, does not have the warmth it had earlier in the voyage. The sea has changed its character. The birds are different. The swell is larger. The sky seems busier. Every experienced person aboard knows the important part is coming. Conversation may continue, work may continue, meals may be eaten, but the Horn sits ahead in everyone's mind. Now imagine looking at the chart. There is Cape Horn printed in black letters. South of it, the Drake Passage. Beyond that, Antarctica. To the west, the Pacific. To the east, the Atlantic. It is just ink and paper, yet it represents weeks of effort and centuries of warning. There may be an odd comfort in seeing it marked so clearly. Humans like names. We name places because names make the world feel a little more manageable. But a name does not calm the water. A label does not lower the wind. Cape Horn on paper is tidy. Cape Horn in weather is another matter entirely. The Cape was named in 1616 by Dutch sailors after Hoorn, a city in the Netherlands. This is a nice reminder that some of the most dramatic names in geography have surprisingly practical origins. A place that became associated with broken masts, giant seas, and freezing terror was named after a hometown. There is something almost funny in that. One can imagine the sea roaring around the ship while someone decides, quite reasonably, to call this frightening new landmark after a familiar Dutch port. Humans do this often. We bring home with us into strange places. We attach known names to unknown shores. It is a way of saying, very quietly, we have been here, and we would like this terrifying rock to be filed correctly. The indigenous history of the region goes back far earlier than European naming. The Agan, also called Yamana, and other indigenous peoples of the far south, lived in these cold maritime environments for thousands of years. They understood the channels, seasons, animals, and shorelines in ways outsiders did not. For them, this region was not merely a blank end of the world. It was home, with knowledge, movement, language, and survival built around the sea and land. That is important to remember. European sailors often described places like Cape Horn as remote or empty, because they were remote from Europe, not because they lacked human meaning. A place can be the edge of one person's map and the centre of another person's life. For global shipping, however, Cape Horn became famous through European and later international maritime routes. The Cape entered logbooks, sea songs, warnings and reputations. It became a place sailors spoke about before reaching it and remembered after leaving it. Rounding the Horn meant dealing with the southern oceanic system at its most direct. There was no canal, no engine strong enough in earlier times to ignore the wind, no satellite image showing the storm's spiral from above. The ship and crew had to meet the place on its own terms. That is what makes the location so powerful in the story. Cape Horn is not feared because it is mysterious in the sense of being unknown now. We can locate it precisely. We can view it from satellites. We can read forecasts, track pressure systems, map currents, and photograph the island. Modern vessels have engines, radar, GPS, stronger materials, better clothing, emergency beacons, and more ways to call for help. The place is no longer unknowable. But knowledge does not make the wind stop. It only helps us understand why the wind is there. An understanding begins with the map. Cape Horn sits where a narrowing continent, a cold southern ocean, a major passage between continents, and the meeting of ocean routes all come together. It is a small headland made large by position. It is not the biggest piece of land, nor the tallest, nor the most visually grand in every moment. But it is placed at one of the most important maritime crossroads on Earth. For centuries, if you wanted to move between the great oceans by sailing around South America, this was the hard corner. The sea did not care whether you were carrying wool, grain, gold seekers, mail, scientific instruments, or one deeply seasick passenger regretting every decision since breakfast. The same weather waited for all. The phrase, edge of the map, is not literally true anymore, of course. Modern maps continue well beyond Cape Horn. Antarctica is charted. The Southern Ocean is studied. Ships cross the Drake Passage every year. Aircraft fly overhead. Researchers measure winds, currents, temperatures and ice. But historically and emotionally, Cape Horn still feels like an edge because it marks a change in scale. North of it, there is a continent with roads, towns, farms, ports and shelter. South of it, there is open water leading toward Antarctica. The human world thins out. The ocean world grows larger. This thinning of the human world is part of what sailors felt. At sea, distance from help changes everything. A storm near a busy coast is dangerous, but there may be rescue stations, other ships, harbours, or at least some chance of fast assistance. Around Cape Horn in earlier centuries, help was often too far away to matter. A ship had to be its own shelter, workshop, hospital, kitchen, and little floating nation. If something broke, the crew repaired it. If someone was injured, they did what they could. If food spoiled, water leaked, sails tore, or the hull strained, there was no convenient place to pull over. The phrase pull over, in fact, is one of the many luxuries land people do not realise they have. So when sailors looked at Cape Horn, they saw more than a cape. They saw the beginning or end of one of the most difficult stretches of a voyage. They saw the place where planning met reality. They saw the question that the sea was about to ask them. Can your ship take this? Can your crew take this? Can your judgment stay clear after days of cold and noise? Can you keep going when the wind says no with impressive consistency? And that brings us gently toward the water itself, because the location explains the reputation, but the sea gives the reputation its teeth. Cape Horn matters because of where it is, but sailors feared it because of what that position does to wind, current and waves. A cape on a calm pond is only a cape. Cape Horn is a cape beside one of the most energetic ocean passages on the planet, where the Atlantic, Pacific and Southern Ocean systems connect, where the weather has room to build, and where the sea can arrive with a long memory of storms far beyond the horizon. To understand why the waters around Cape Horn turn so wild, it helps to forget, just for a moment, the way oceans are shown on a classroom map. On the map, the Atlantic is on one side, the Pacific is on the other, and the Southern Ocean sits below, wrapping around Antarctica like a broad blue belt. It all looks very calm there, spread out in polite colours, with neat labels and clean edges. The trouble is that water has never been especially interested in neat labels, neither has wind, and around Cape Horn both of them arrive with a great deal of unfinished business. This is not a place where one simple thing causes the danger. It is not just the wind, it is not just the current, it is not just the cold, it is not just the waves. Cape Horn is feared because all of these things meet in the same neighbourhood, and none of them are especially good at waiting their turn. The air pushes the sea, the current moves beneath it. The shape of the ocean floor changes how the water behaves. Storms roll through from west to east. Cold water and warmer water shift around each other. The continent narrows. Antarctica waits to the south. And the ship, poor little human invention that it is, must pass through the middle of it all, trying to remain upright and dignified, like someone carrying soup through a crowded train carriage. The meeting of oceans near Cape Horn is sometimes described as the place where the Atlantic and Pacific come together. That is true in the broad navigational sense, but it is not quite the full story. The water there is also deeply tied to the Southern Ocean, the great ring of the ocean that circles Antarctica. This matters because the Southern Ocean is different from the other great oceans. The Atlantic is interrupted by continents. The Pacific is vast, but also bordered and shaped by land. The Indian Ocean has its own northern limits, but the Southern Ocean can move around Antarctica with very little land blocking its path. It is one of the few places on Earth where wind and water can travel around the planet in a continuous loop. That loop changes everything. When wind blows over water, it transfers energy into the sea. A short breeze over a small lake makes small waves. A strong wind blowing for a long time across a large open ocean makes much larger waves. The distance over which the wind blows is called fetch, which sounds gentle enough until you imagine it stretching across thousands of miles of open southern water. Around the far south, the wind can keep pushing and pushing, with no continent politely stepping in to say, "That's quite enough, thank you." By the time the swell reaches the region near Cape Horn, it may have been shaped by storms far away, travelling onward long after the weather that made it has moved along. So a ship near Cape Horn may not only be dealing with the wind it can feel at that moment, it may also be dealing with waves born somewhere else entirely. One swell may arrive from one direction, another from a different direction, while local wind tears at the surface and builds shorter, steeper seas on top. This is part of what makes the water feel confused. It is not always a clean up and down motion. The ship may climb one wave only to meet another at an awkward angle. It may roll, pitch, slam, twist and shudder in ways that make even experienced sailors speak less cheerfully. A regular wave pattern can be difficult. A confused sea is worse because it is harder to anticipate. The deck does not rise where your body expects it to rise. Your hand reaches for a rail that is suddenly not where it seemed to be. A kettle, if anyone has been optimistic enough to use one, develops ambitions of its own. Underneath this surface trouble is the movement of current. The Antarctic Circumpolar Current flows around Antarctica from west to east, driven largely by the strong westerly winds of the Southern Ocean. It is not a small coastal current or a narrow stream slipping along a shoreline. It is the dominant current system of the Southern Ocean, connecting the Atlantic, Pacific and Indian Oceans in one enormous circulation. Near Drake Passage, between South America and Antarctica, this flow is squeezed through one of its most important gaps. Not squeezed in the way water passes through a garden hose, of course. The Drake Passage is wide by human standards, but by the standards of a current that circles a continent, the gap between Cape Horn and the Antarctic Peninsula matters. It shapes the flow. It focuses movement. It creates a place where the ocean's large-scale circulation has to pass through a particular region. For sailors, that current could be both useful and dangerous. If the wind and current were cooperating, a ship might make progress more easily. But cooperation is not guaranteed in these waters. When strong wind blows against a current, the sea can become steeper and more violent. Waves are not just pushed along, they can pile up, shorten and break more sharply. This is one of those pieces of ocean behaviour that sounds technical until you picture it simply. Imagine walking along a moving walkway at an airport. If you walk with it, you move smoothly. If you try to walk against it while someone is pushing you backward with a mattress, the arrangement becomes less graceful. Now replace the walkway with a current, the mattress with gale force wind, and yourself with a ship carrying cargo, crew, and several people who would very much like the day to be over. The shape of the land also plays a role. South America tapers down toward Tierra del Fuego, and Antarctica lies far to the south. Between them is the Drake Passage, a broad but important corridor. Weather systems moving through the Southern Ocean can pass this way with little resistance. The strong westerly winds, already powerful because of the lack of land at those latitudes, are guided and affected by the geography around them. The Andes stretch down the western side of South America, and the Antarctic Peninsula reaches upward from the south. The atmosphere does not behave like water in a pipe, but landforms still influence how air moves. In the far south, where the winds are already strong, any focusing of that movement can make the conditions around the passage feel even more severe. Then there is the ocean floor, which may be out of sight but is never out of the story. To someone standing on deck, the sea surface is the obvious problem. Those waves are very hard to ignore, especially when one of them has just come aboard without being invited. But beneath the surface, the depth and shape of the seabed affect currents and turbulence. Around the Drake Passage and the waters near Cape Horn, the seafloor is not simply a flat bowl. There are ridges, shelves, slopes and uneven features. As moving water crosses rough topography, it can be disturbed, redirected and mixed. At the surface, changes in depth can also affect wave shape. When large swells move from deeper water towards shallower areas, the waves can grow steeper. A long ocean swell that was already serious can become shorter, sharper, and more dangerous. To a ship, that difference matters greatly. A broad swell may lift and lower a hull. A steep breaking wave may strike it like a wall. This is why the waters around Cape Horn cannot be understood by looking at just one layer. The sky is doing one thing. The surface is doing another. The deep current is part of a larger global system. The seafloor is quietly interfering from below. The temperature of the water affects density and movement. Storms come through and rearrange the whole scene. There is no single villain here, no one dramatic cause. It is more like a badly organised committee where every member has brought a different problem and all of them are speaking at once. The weather systems themselves are another reason these waters are so unsettled. In the Southern Ocean, low-pressure systems often move from west to east, circling the planet. They bring strong winds, shifts in pressure, rain, snow, sleet, and rapid changes in conditions. A sailor could have one kind of sea in the morning and a very different one by evening. The sky might darken, the barometer might fall, the wind might back or veer, clouds might thicken along the horizon. In warmer latitudes, a storm can be frightening enough, but around Cape Horn, the cold makes everything harder and the sea has more room to build. The storm does not need to be the largest storm on Earth to become dangerous. It only needs to arrive in a place already prepared for trouble. It is useful to remember that sailors feared these waters long before modern science explained all the mechanisms. They did not need the phrase Antarctic circumpolar current to know that the sea had a powerful eastward set. They did not need satellite altimeters to know that waves could be huge. They did not need computer models to understand that certain winds were bad news. Sailors learned by watching, by listening, by comparing voyages, by reading logbooks, and sometimes by surviving conditions that explain themselves with unnecessary enthusiasm. Their knowledge was practical. If the wind shifted this way, reduce sail. If the swell changed that way, prepare for worse. If the glass fell quickly, do not assume the day is improving. The sea has many ways of teaching, most of them damp. The meeting of waters also creates biological richness, though sailors trying to stay alive may not have paused to admire it. Where currents meet and mix, nutrients can be brought upward. Cold southern waters, subantarctic waters, and the broader circulation around Antarctica help support marine life. Seabirds, whales, seals, fish, and smaller organisms are all part of the region's living system. This is another reminder that dangerous for humans does not mean empty or broken. The same restless mixing that makes the water hard for ships can also make it productive for life. The ocean is not trying to be hostile, it is simply doing what physics, climate and geography allow it to do. Unfortunately, physics has never been especially concerned about whether a sailor has had enough sleep. For a sailing ship, the direction of the prevailing wind was one of the central problems. The strong winds of the far southern latitudes generally blow from west to east. A ship travelling eastward around the world could use those winds, though even then the passage could be dangerous. But a ship trying to round Cape Horn from east to west faced a much harder task. It had to work against the wind, tacking back and forth, making progress in angles rather than in a straight line. Every mile gained might be paid for with exhaustion. A bad blow could drive the vessel backward, undoing days of work. Imagine climbing a staircase where every few minutes someone turns the staircase into a slide. That is not an exact nautical description, but it captures the mood. This is where the meeting of oceans becomes a human problem. Water and wind may be large-scale systems, but their effects arrive in small, personal ways. A hand on a wet rope, a boot slipping on deck, a sail tearing loose in darkness, a captain trying to decide whether to run before the storm or hold a difficult course, a crew member trying to sleep in a bunk that behaves less like a bed and more like a wooden drawer in an earthquake. These are the places where geography becomes experience. The Atlantic and Pacific may meet in a grand planetary sense, but for the sailor, they meet in the stomach, the fingers, the knees, and the nerves. Even modern vessels respect the area because size and technology do not cancel the sea. Engines help, steel helps, forecasts help, stabilizers, radar, GPS, satellite communications and modern rescue systems help enormously. But the Southern Ocean still has scale on its side. A ship may be powerful, but it is still moving through water that is being shaped by wind fields hundreds or thousands of miles wide. A forecast can warn you about a storm, but it does not flatten the waves. A radar can show hazards, but it cannot make a steep sea gentle. Modern sailors are not helpless in the way earlier crews often were, but they are still operating in a region where respect remains practical, not sentimental. The meeting near Cape Horn is also not a fixed line. You cannot sail to one exact seam where the Atlantic politely stops and the Pacific begins, as if the oceans were two carpets meeting in a hallway. Ocean boundaries are human tools. They help us describe the planet. Real seawater mixes, moves, sinks, rises, warms, cools, freshens and flows. The water around Cape Horn is constantly being shaped by forces that do not care about names. This is why the phrase meeting of oceans is useful but incomplete. The danger comes not from a simple collision of two bodies of water, but from the ongoing interaction of a global current, powerful winds, storm tracks, cold southern conditions, complex seabed features, and the narrowing geography between South America and Antarctica. The more closely we look, the less the place seems like a single point and the more it becomes a system. Cape Horn is the visible marker, the name we can put on a map and remember. But the wildness belongs to the system around it. The Southern Ocean sends in the swell. The westerlies drive the current and the waves. Drake Passage focuses the flow. The weather changes quickly. The cold reduces the margin for error. The seafloor reshapes the water. Land is close enough to be a hazard and far enough from easy. Shelter to be unhelpful. A ship passing through is not simply rounding a cape. It is crossing through one of the planet's great pieces of moving machinery. And like any powerful machinery, it can be calm for a while. This is important, because Cape Horn is not always in a state of dramatic violence. There are quieter days. There are windows of better weather. There are moments when the sea lowers its shoulders and lets a ship pass with less trouble than expected. Sailors know this too. A dangerous place does not have to be dangerous every minute to deserve its reputation. A sleeping dog can still have teeth. The fear comes from what can happen, how quickly it can happen, and how severe the consequences can be if it happens when a ship is exposed. This uncertainty adds to the mental weight of the passage. If the sea were always terrible, then at least everyone would know what to expect. But the ocean does not work like that. A crew might approach in moderate conditions, hoping the forecast or the sky would hold. Then the wind could rise, the swell could steepen, the pressure could fall, rain could reduce visibility, a manageable sea could become a hard one, and a hard sea could become dangerous. Around Cape Horn, the question was not only, is it bad now? It was also, what is it becoming? That question has kept many sailors awake. The phrase, the meeting of oceans, also carries a kind of old human awe. Long before global oceanography, people understood that certain waters felt different. Sailors noticed changes in colour, temperature, swell, birds, winds and currents. They knew when they had entered a new sea, even if they could not explain every reason. Around Cape Horn, those changes were not subtle. The voyage southward brought colder air, longer swells, harsher weather, and a sense of exposure. To pass from one ocean to another at that latitude was not simply to move across a boundary. It was to enter a zone where the planet's circulation revealed itself in a physical, immediate way. So when sailors feared Cape Horn, they were not afraid of a superstition, though superstitions certainly travelled well aboard ships. They were afraid of a place where the ordinary rules of wind and water gathered into extraordinary conditions. They were afraid of long fetch, strong westerlies, eastward current, sudden weather, steep seas, cold water, poor visibility, and the hard fact that ships break when enough force is applied in the wrong way. They feared it because they understood, either through science or through bruises, that this was one of the places where the ocean had room to become large. And now, with the waters beginning to make more sense, with the map no longer quite so flat and harmless, we can listen more closely to the air above them. Because the sea around Cape Horn does not become wild by itself, it is worked upon constantly by the winds of the far south, those famous belts of moving air with names that sound almost too dramatic until you meet them. The roaring 40s, the furious 50s, and the screaming 60s, each one a reminder that at the bottom of the world, the atmosphere has a very strong opinion about sailing. Wind is one of those things that can seem harmless when it is small. A breeze through an open window, a little movement in the curtains, leaves turning over in a garden, the sort of wind that makes laundry flap on a line and makes people say pleasant things about fresh air. But at sea, wind is not only weather, it is power, it is direction, it is engine, obstacle, warning, and sometimes enemy. Around Cape Horn, wind becomes one of the main reasons the place earned its reputation. Not because wind is rare there, but because it is so often present, so often strong, and so often exactly where a sailor would rather it not be. The winds that matter most here are the great westerlies of the southern hemisphere. They blow mostly from west to east, circling the planet in broad belts of moving air. Sailors gave these belts names that do not try very hard to sound calm. The roaring 40s, the furious 50s, the screaming 60s. These are not official names written by someone in a neat office with a mild cup of tea. They are sailor names, practical names, names given by people who had heard the rigging howl, watched the sea rise, and decided that ordinary vocabulary was no longer doing enough work. Cape Horn lies near the edge of these southern wind belts, deep enough into the far south to feel their force. To understand why that matters, we need to picture the planet not as a still globe on a shelf, but as a rotating, heated, moving system. Warm air rises near the equator, cold air sinks closer to the poles, Earth spins beneath it all, pressure systems form, air moves, the rotation of the planet bends that movement, and large belts of prevailing winds appear. In the middle latitudes, those winds tend to blow from the west. In the southern hemisphere, they sweep around the world with very little land to interrupt them. That last detail is important. In the northern hemisphere, the westerlies have to deal with North America, Europe, Asia, mountains, forests, cities, deserts, and all the other inconvenient bits of land that get in the way of air moving smoothly around the planet. The wind is broken up, redirected, slowed, disturbed, and complicated. It still becomes powerful, of course, especially in storms, but it does not have the same uninterrupted highway. In the southern hemisphere, especially south of about 40 degrees, there is far more ocean than land. The wind can travel and travel, crossing open water with almost nothing to stop it. It is less like a breeze moving through streets and more like a crowd running through an empty hall. This is why the roaring 40s roar. Between roughly 40 and 50 degrees south, strong westerly winds are common. Farther south, in the furious 50s, the winds can be even more severe. Farther still, in the screaming 60s, the name gives you a fair idea of the atmosphere's manners. Cape Horn sits around 56 degrees south, placing it in the region sailors associated with the furious 50s, close to the cold, hard conditions of the higher southern latitudes. A ship there was not merely waiting for a storm to arrive. It was already in a part of the planet where the general wind pattern could be rough, even before a proper storm joined in. For sailing ships, this was a very big matter. Before engines, wind was the only way to move a large vessel across the sea. A good wind was a gift. A steady wind from the right direction could carry a ship for days, pushing it across open water faster than human muscle ever could. But wind from the wrong direction was not a gift. It was a locked door. A sailing ship cannot sail straight into the wind. It must tack, moving at angles, making progress through skill and patience. In ordinary weather, this is a normal part of sailing. Around Cape Horn, with heavy seas, cold air and powerful westerlies, it could become miserable work. A ship trying to pass from the Atlantic into the Pacific had to round the Horn westward, against the prevailing westerlies. This meant the wind was often coming from the very direction the ship wanted to go. That is one of the reasons the passage became so difficult. It was not enough to survive bad weather. The crew had to make progress through it. The ship might spend days beating into strong winds, gaining a little distance, losing some of it, changing course, adjusting sails, and trying again. It was slow, exhausting, and deeply frustrating. The ocean, with its usual charm, did not offer a customer service desk. In strong wind, every action aboard a sailing ship becomes harder. Sail must be reduced before the wind becomes too much for the canvas and rigging. That may sound simple when said indoors, but reefing sail in a gale is dangerous work. Sailors had to climb into the rigging, move along yards high above the deck, handle heavy wet canvas, and secure it while the ship rolled and pitched beneath them. The wind did not pause for this. Rain did not pause. Spray did not pause. The mast leaned, the ropes jerked, the sail cracked, and the sea below moved in dark slopes and white foam. One mistake could mean injury or death. Even a small task done in such conditions demanded strength, timing, and nerve. The sound of the wind was part of the fear too. We often think of danger visually, as something seen. A wave, a cliff, a dark cloud. But sailors lived with sound. The whistle in the rigging, the slap of loose canvas, the groan of spars, the deep impact of waves against the hull, the change in pitch when the wind strengthened. A ship in heavy weather was not quiet. It spoke constantly, sometimes in creaks and knocks, sometimes in sudden cracks that made everyone listen. Experienced sailors could hear trouble developing, a line under too much strain, sail beginning to tear, a block failing, a mast complaining in a way no one enjoyed. Around Cape Horn, the wind made the whole ship into an instrument, and not a soothing one, unless your idea of relaxation includes a cello being thrown down a staircase. The westerlies also built the waves, Wind and sea are closely connected. The longer and harder wind blows across water, the more energy it transfers to the surface. In the far south, the wind often has great distances of open ocean to work with. This means waves can grow large before they ever reach Cape Horn. A storm far away can send swell across the Southern Ocean, and local winds can add fresh waves on top. When the westerlies are strong, the surface becomes a moving record of all that energy. The result is not just uncomfortable, it can threaten the structure and control of a vessel. For a ship running with the wind, strong westerlies could be fast but risky. A vessel travelling eastward might be pushed powerfully along, covering distance quickly. In the age of sail, some routes use the southern westerlies to make faster passages, especially across the southern Indian Ocean and toward Australia. Sailors spoke of running the easting down, using the winds to drive ships east. But speed at sea is not always safety. A ship going fast before heavy seas can broach, yaw, lose control, or be overwhelmed from astern. If a following wave lifts the stern and slews the vessel sideways, the next wave may strike with great force. Even helpful wind can become too much help, which is a problem many of us know from relatives giving directions in a kitchen. For ships trying to move westward around Cape Horn, the same westerlies were a wall. They could pin a ship back, drive it south, or force it to spend long periods making little useful progress. The crew might watch the same kind of weather repeat itself, gale after gale, squall after squall, a brief lull, then another hard blow. This repetition mattered. A single gale could be survived by a strong crew and vessel. But repeated gales wore everything down. Sails frayed, ropes weakened, food became harder to prepare, sleep became broken, tempers shortened, injuries accumulated. A ship is not just wood, iron, canvas, and rope. It is also people, and people do not remain fresh forever when soaked, cold, frightened, and repeatedly thrown against hard surfaces. The wind near Cape Horn could also shift quickly as weather systems passed. The Southern Ocean is crossed by strong low-pressure systems, and these bring changing wind direction and speed. A captain had to think ahead. If the wind backed or veered, if pressure fell, if clouds changed, if the sea began to look different, decisions had to be made. Carry more sail to gain ground or reduce early to protect the ship. Hold course or run off. Try to claw away from a dangerous lee shore or give the ship more sea room. These choices were not academic. A lee shore, where the wind blows a vessel toward land, was one of the great terrors of sailing. Around Cape Horn, with hard coastlines, poor visibility, and little margin, being driven toward land by strong wind could become a nightmare very quickly. A useful thing to remember is that wind itself cannot be seen. We see what it does. Spray torn from wave crests, clouds moving fast, sails filling or flogging, smoke blown flat, birds hanging in the air, a line of darker water advancing across the sea. This invisibility gives wind a strange character. It is everywhere and nowhere. It presses against the body, but it has no shape you can hold. Sailors learn to read it through signs. The surface of the water, the feel on the face, the strain in the rigging, the behaviour of the ship. Around Cape Horn, those signs often said the same thing in different ways. More wind is coming. Be ready. And readiness was physical. There is a tendency, from the comfort of land, to imagine seamanship as a matter of bravery and navigation alone. Those were essential, yes. But much of survival came down to hard, repeated work. Hauling lines, securing gear, pumping water, repairing damage, changing sail, steering for hours in freezing spray, keeping watch in darkness, cooking if possible, eating if possible, sleeping when the body allowed it. The wind turned all of this into labour. It made doors slam, lamps swing, ropes whip, voices vanish, and simple movement difficult. To cross a deck in a gale required care. To work on one required skill. To do it for days required a stubbornness that does not always look dramatic, but is probably one of the most useful human qualities ever invented. The cold made the wind worse. A strong wind in warm weather can be unpleasant. A strong wind in cold weather cuts through clothing, steals heat, stiffens hands, and turns wetness into a serious problem. Around Cape Horn, sailors were often wet and cold together, which is a miserable partnership. Spray could soak through layers, rain could come sideways, snow or sleet could sting the face. A person working on deck might be moving hard one moment and shivering the next. Cold reduces dexterity. It makes knots harder. It makes judgment slower. It turns fatigue into something heavier. Wind chill is not just a number in a forecast. It is the body losing heat faster because moving air carries warmth away. For a sailor who needed hands to work, cold wind was not a background detail. It was an active hazard. Even breathing could feel different in hard wind. Anyone who has stood on a very windy shore knows the odd feeling of air being taken from the mouth before it is properly used. In a storm at sea, with spray flying and the ship moving sharply, the simple act of turning your head to inhale can become part of the rhythm of work. Speak, and the wind may tear your words away. Shout, and only the person nearest you may hear. Orders had to be clear. Hand signals, habit, and training mattered. Confusion in heavy weather could waste precious seconds. Around the Horn, the wind did not merely move the ship, it interfered with communication, balance, warmth, and thought. The names of the wind belts also tell us something about sailor culture. The roaring 40s, furious 50s, and screaming 60s are vivid because they are based on lived experience. They are not delicate names. They are not scientific classifications with tidy Latin roots. They sound like weather described after the fact by people who had earned the right to be annoyed, and they are useful because they remind us that latitude matters. As ships moved south, they entered different atmospheric zones. The change was not imaginary. The sea and wind altered. A captain who knew the route understood that each degree south could bring different risks. On land, a degree of latitude is just a line on a map. At sea, it can be a change in the personality of the day. There is also a reason these winds are more famous in the south than in the north. The southern hemisphere's geography allows them to be more continuous. Around the latitudes of the roaring 40s, there is relatively little land to block the flow. South of Africa, south of Australia, south of New Zealand, and across the South Pacific, the wind can sweep over long open stretches. Cape Horn is one of the few major places where land interrupts that circulation. It is as if the westerlies have been racing around the planet and suddenly meet the pointed end of South America. That meeting helps explain why the region is so lively. The wind is not arriving after a gentle stroll. It has crossed oceans. The wind also interacts with the mountains and broken land of southern South America. The Andes, extending down toward Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, influence weather patterns. Air moving across mountain ranges can be lifted, squeezed, dried, cooled, accelerated, or redirected. Local conditions around channels and islands can shift quickly. A ship may experience gusts, squalls, or sudden changes in wind direction near land. In open ocean, the main wind pattern is difficult enough. Near complex coastlines, it can become even less predictable. The old sailing directions for such regions were full of warnings because sailors knew that land does not simply sit beside weather, it reshapes it. The term squall deserves a little attention. A squall is a sudden increase in wind speed, often with rain or a sharp change in weather. At Cape Horn, squalls could sweep down with little warning, especially in unstable conditions. A ship carrying too much sail when a squall hit could be knocked down or damaged. Too little sail, and it might lose control in heavy seas. This was the constant balancing act. The crew needed enough canvas to steer and move, but not so much that the wind could overpower the vessel. The right amount of sail was not fixed. It changed with every hour, every sky, every sea. Seamanship was not just knowing what to do. It was knowing when to do it which is far more difficult and much less appreciated by people who have never tried to fold a wet bedsheet in a gale. For older square-rigged ships, sail handling was especially demanding. These vessels carried large rectangular sails on yards across the masts. They were powerful and capable of long ocean voyages, but managing them in heavy weather required many hands. When wind increased, crews had to shorten sail in stages. Top-gallants, royals, topsails, courses. Each had its own gear, its own risks, its own place in the working life of the ship. In cold southern weather, wet canvas became heavy. Lines could jam or freeze. A torn sail could beat itself to pieces and damage rigging. A loose spar could become deadly. The wind found every weakness. It was a very thorough inspector and rarely gave encouraging feedback. Steam and later diesel engines changed the relationship with wind, but they did not erase it. A powered vessel can make headway against wind in a way a sailing ship cannot, but heavy wind still raises seas, reduces speed, increases fuel use, affects steering, and creates danger on deck. In the open southern waters, even modern ships may alter course or speed to manage conditions. Small craft and yachts must plan with great care. Racing sailors who round the Horn today do so with advanced equipment, communications and forecasting, yet the place remains serious. The old fear has been reduced by knowledge and technology, but the underlying forces are still there, still moving west to east, still shaping the water. Wind also shaped the emotional experience of the passage. There is a difference between a storm that arrives suddenly and one you can hear building over hours. Around Cape Horn, the wind could become a companion of the worst kind, always present, pressing against the ship, filling the ears, making sleep shallow, making rest uncertain. A person can become tired not only from work but from noise. Constant wind wears on the mind. It removes stillness. Even below deck, the sound remains. The rush through rigging, the thump of sea, the creak of timbers, the shifting of cargo, the occasional crash that makes everyone briefly stop pretending to sleep. Fear at sea is often not one sharp moment, but a long condition. The wind helps create that condition. There is an old respect among sailors for wind because it is both necessary and dangerous. Without it, a sailing ship lies helpless, rolling in swell, sails hanging empty, crew waiting and waiting. Too little wind and the voyage stalls. Too much and the voyage may end badly. The ideal wind is useful, steady, and from a favourable direction. Cape Horn often offered something less ideal. It offered power without convenience. A sailor had to use what could be used and survive what could not. This required humility. The sea does not reward people for pretending conditions are better than they are. Cape Horn especially has never had much patience for optimism unsupported by reefed canvas. The westerlies were feared, but they were also part of the logic of global sailing. Mariners learned to use wind belts. The trade winds helped ships cross tropical oceans. The westerlies helped ships return or move eastward in higher latitudes. Routes were built around these patterns. The great age of sail was not random wandering. It was a system of wind knowledge, current knowledge, seasonal timing, and accumulated experience. Cape Horn sat at one of the hard places in that system. It was where a useful global wind pattern became a severe local trial, depending on direction, season, and luck. And luck did matter. Sailors are often superstitious because the sea gives them good reason to notice uncertainty. Two ships might take the same general route and meet different conditions. One rounds the Horn with difficulty but without disaster. Another arrives a week later and is battered for days. A third waits, turns back, loses gear, or never arrives. Modern meteorology helps explain why, but for older sailors, the result could feel like the mood of the place itself. Cape Horn became almost a character in maritime imagination. Some days it allowed passage, other days it refused. Of course, a cape does not decide anything, it is rock. But when wind and water behave with enough force, human beings naturally start using personal language. The horn was angry. The horn was kind. The horn was waiting. It is not scientifically precise, but it is emotionally understandable. The strongest winds were not constant in exactly the same way every day. The atmosphere pulses, shifts, and reorganizes. Storm tracks move. Pressure systems deepen or weaken. Seasons influence patterns. But the reputation comes from the frequency and strength of hard winds in the region. A sailor could not assume calm. That changed planning. It changed how ships were prepared, how cargo was secured, how watches were set, how sails were managed, and how captains thought about risk. In an easier sea, one might recover from a bad decision. Around Cape Horn, the wind could narrow the choices quickly. A delayed order, a worn line, an overloaded sail, or a mistaken position could become serious because the weather did not leave much room for correction. There is a practical lesson hidden in all this, though it is not a dramatic one. Much of seamanship is preparation before the worst arrives. Secure gear while you still can. Reduce sail before the squall hits, not after. Check lines before they fail. Keep the crew rested if possible, because the difficult hours will come. Around Cape Horn, preparation was a form of respect. Sailors who treated the wind as a manageable nuisance could learn otherwise quickly. Those who survived tended to understand that the time to be careful is before the ocean has made its point. From where we are now, dry and comfortable, the names, roaring 40s and furious 50s, may sound almost adventurous. They have a strong, old-fashioned ring to them, like labels on a map in a captain's cabin. But behind the names are real physical conditions. Broad belts of prevailing westerly winds, a spinning planet, a southern hemisphere with wide open oceans, long fetch, powerful storm systems, cold air, sea room for waves to build. And at the end of South America, Cape Horn placed directly in the path of it all. So when sailors feared the winds around the Horn, they were not fearing empty legend. They were fearing the engine that drove the whole difficult sea. The wind made the waves larger. The wind pushed ships off course. The wind tore sails, strained masts, froze hands, stole sleep, hid voices, and turned simple work into danger. It was not always malicious, because weather is not malicious, but it was relentless enough to feel that way. And once that wind had blown across enough open water, once it had raised the swell and worked the sea into motion, the next danger rose beneath the ship itself. Waves so large and uneven that sailors described them not as water passing by, but as moving hills, ridges and walls, each one coming on with the heavy patience of the Southern Ocean. By the time the wind has had its say around Cape Horn, the sea has usually formed an opinion of its own, and that opinion very often is large, cold, uneven, and arriving from more than one direction at once. Wind may be the engine, but waves are the result the sailor has to live with. You can hear wind, you can brace against it, you can reduce sail, change course and mutter something private into your collar, but waves lift the entire world beneath you. They take the ship, the deck, the bunks, the stove, the cargo, the crew, and every unsecured spoon aboard, and they remind all of it that solid ground was never part of the agreement. Around Cape Horn, waves became one of the great terrors because they were not merely high. Height is frightening, yes, but height alone is not the whole story. A wave can be tall and still have a long, rolling shape that a vessel can ride if handled well. The real trouble begins when waves are large, steep, breaking, irregular, and mixed with other waves moving at different angles. That is when the sea becomes hard to read. A ship may lift gently on one swell, only to drop into a trough where another wave strikes from the side. It may climb a ridge of water, pause for a sickening second, then fall with a shudder that runs through the hull like a warning. It may roll so far that loose gear becomes airborne, and people begin making quiet promises about how they will appreciate ordinary furniture much more if they ever see it again. The waves near Cape Horn begin with distance. That may sound odd, because when we think of a wave, we usually picture the water in front of us. But ocean waves have history. They are born from wind acting over water, and the longer the wind blows, the farther it blows, and the stronger it blows, the more energy the sea can gather. In the Southern Ocean, the wind has enormous stretches of open water to work with. There are few land masses at those latitudes to break the flow. The westerlies can circle the planet, driving the surface again and again, creating swell that travels far from the storms that first made it. So when a ship approached Cape Horn, it might be meeting water that had been shaped by weather far beyond the horizon. The gale overhead was only part of the situation. Beneath it, long swells could already be arriving from a storm hundreds or thousands of miles away. Another swell might be arriving from a different system. Local wind could be building shorter, sharper waves on top of the older swell. This layering is one of the reasons sailors speak with such respect about confused seas. Confused does not mean the sea has misplaced its spectacles. It means the wave patterns do not line up neatly. They interfere, combine, cancel, rise, cross, and break in ways that make movement unpredictable. For a human body, confused seas are exhausting. On land, we take for granted that the floor will remain where we left it. At sea, especially in heavy weather, the floor becomes unreliable. It tips, rises, falls, jerks sideways, and occasionally behaves as though it has developed a personal dislike of ankles. Every movement has to be timed. Walking becomes a negotiation. Sleeping becomes an act of optimism. Cooking becomes a practical joke. Even sitting still takes effort because your muscles are constantly correcting for motion. Over hours and days, this wears people down. The sea does not have to throw someone overboard to weaken them. It can simply keep moving. For a ship, waves are a structural problem. A vessel is built to flex, but it has limits. When a long ship is supported by water at the bow and stern while the middle hangs over a trough, the hull is under one kind of stress. When the middle is supported by a crest and the bow and stern are lower, it is under another. Waves twist and bend the structure. In rough seas, this happens again and again. Wooden ships creaked and groaned under such loads. Iron and steel ships could also strain, though in different ways. Cargo might shift. Fastenings could loosen. Pumps might be needed if seams opened or water found its way inside. The wave you see outside is also a force travelling through the ship itself. Then there is the danger of green water on deck. Sea spray is one thing. It stings the face, soaks clothing, and makes everyone look deeply unhappy. But it is not the same as a whole body of water coming aboard. Green water means a breaking wave or heavy sea has swept across the deck as a mass, not just as spray. It can knock people down, smash gear, tear away boats, flood openings, and damage deck structures. On old sailing ships, it could sweep along the deck with enough force to break limbs or carry a person into the sea. Modern vessels are stronger, but heavy water on deck remains dangerous. Water is heavy. It does not need sharp edges to do harm. It only needs speed and mass. Cape Horn's waves also had a way of attacking from angles. A ship is usually safest when it can meet waves in a controlled way, either bow on, stern on, or at an angle chosen by the helmsman and captain. But in confused seas, control becomes harder. If waves are coming from multiple directions, the ship may be lifted and struck in different ways at nearly the same time. A beam sea, where waves hit from the side, can cause dangerous rolling. A following sea, where waves come from behind, can push the stern around and threaten to broach the vessel, turning it sideways to the sea. A head sea, where waves come from ahead, can stop progress and pound the bow. None of these are ideal. The ocean, with its usual lack of concern for paperwork, may offer several at once. For sailing ships, heavy seas complicated everything the wind had already made difficult. The sails needed wind, but too much sail could overpower the ship. Too little sail, and the vessel might lose steerage, making it harder to keep the bow or stern properly aligned with the waves. Steering itself could become brutal work. The helmsman had to feel the ship, watch the sea, and respond quickly. A slow response might let the vessel fall off course at the wrong moment. A badly timed turn could expose the side of the ship to a breaking sea. This was not steering in the relaxed sense of guiding a car along a quiet road. It was more like trying to keep a stubborn house pointed correctly while hills of water moved under it. One of the reasons waves around Cape Horn became so feared was that there was often no easy escape. In some coastal waters, a ship may run for shelter. Around the Horn, shelter could be distant, difficult, or dangerous to approach. The surrounding region has islands and channels, but narrow or rocky waters are not necessarily safe in a storm. A vessel in heavy seas may actually need open water, because open water gives room to maneuver and reduces the immediate risk of being driven onto land. This creates a hard truth. Sometimes the safest place in a storm is still a very unsafe place. A ship may have to remain at sea because the alternatives are worse. That is the sort of logic the ocean specialises in. It is not comforting, but it is clear. The Southern Ocean's long fetch is central to the size of the swell. Fetch is the distance over water that wind blows without interruption. The longer the fetch, the more opportunity waves have to grow. Around the far southern latitudes, the fetch can be enormous because the winds are not stopped by continents. Waves can gather across open water, becoming long-period swells. A long-period swell carries energy efficiently and can travel vast distances. When such swell reaches an area where local winds, currents, or depth changes interfere, conditions can become rougher and steeper. Near Cape Horn, where currents and seafloor features add complexity, the surface can become especially demanding. The Antarctic circumpolar current adds another layer. This enormous current flows from west to east around Antarctica and passes through the Drake Passage. A current by itself does not automatically make waves huge, but when current, wind, and swell interact, the sea state can become much worse. If wind blows against current, waves can steepen and break more readily. If swell crosses current at an angle, wave patterns can become irregular. If the seafloor redirects the current or causes mixing, the surface may reflect that disturbance in subtle or dramatic ways. To the sailor, it may simply feel as if the sea is coming from everywhere. To the scientist, it is the result of energy moving through air and water. To the cook trying to keep a pot in place, it is nonsense and should stop immediately. Bathymetry, the shape of the ocean floor, is another hidden force. We tend to imagine the deep ocean as a smooth basin, but it is not smooth. It has ridges, plateaus, slopes, channels, and fracture zones. The Drake Passage is not just a blank gap between continents. Water moving through it interacts with underwater features. This can create turbulence, internal waves, and mixing below the surface. Even when the details are invisible from deck, they are part of the system that makes these waters energetic. The surface is only the top page of a thick book, and around Cape Horn the pages underneath are also busy. For older sailors, none of these scientific terms were necessary. They knew the result. They knew that the seas were big, that the waves could break badly, that the ship could be pooped by a following sea, meaning a wave could break over the stern, and that decks could be swept clean in the worst possible sense. They knew that a vessel could be knocked down, rolled, dismasted, or damaged beyond repair. They knew that a man overboard in those waters was in terrible danger. The cold alone shortened survival time, and the waves made recovery difficult. A lifebuoy, a line, a shout, a turn of the ship. All of it became harder when the sea was high and visibility poor. There is a special fear in watching a large wave approach. It is not like watching an object come across a room. A wave is part of the room. The whole surface rises into it. The horizon changes shape. The ship begins to respond before the wave arrives, lifting, slowing, turning, or sliding. In daylight, the crew might see a darker wall of water under a broken crest. At night, they might only hear it or feel the stern lift. Sometimes the most dangerous wave is the one that comes after the one everyone noticed. A ship may survive a heavy sea, begin to recover, and then be struck by another before it has regained position. The ocean does not believe in taking turns. The phrase rogue wave is often used in stories about the sea, sometimes too casually. A rogue wave is not just a large wave, it is a wave significantly larger than the surrounding sea, appearing suddenly and posing serious danger. Such waves can occur in many oceans, and their causes involve interactions among wave systems, currents, and non-linear wave behaviour. Around the Southern Ocean, where strong winds, long fetch, and complex seas are common, sailors have long reported unusually large waves. Modern instruments have confirmed that very large individual waves do occur in southern waters. This does not mean every terrifying story is accurate in every detail, but it does mean the old accounts were not simply sailor exaggeration after too much time in port. The sea really can produce waves that seem out of proportion to the waves around them. A large wave does not need to sink a ship to become a serious event. It can break windows, flood compartments, damage steering gear, carry away lifeboats, destroy deck equipment, or injure crew. On a sailing ship, it could tear away bulwarks, smash hatches, or overwhelm men working on deck. Damage above the waterline can still become fatal if it reduces the crew's ability to manage the ship. A broken spar, a torn sail, a jammed pump, a flooded galley, a smashed boat, a lost compass binnacle. Each problem adds to the next. Disasters at sea are often chains. One thing breaks, which makes the next thing harder, which makes the next decision riskier. Heavy waves are very good at starting chains. The psychological effect of waves is also worth noticing. Wind makes noise, but waves create motion and impact. A ship dropping off a wave can slam hard enough to wake every person aboard. The hull shudders, dishes crash, beams creak, water rushes along the deck. The body reacts before the mind has finished explaining the situation. Over time, this constant impact can create a kind of watchfulness that is difficult to relax from. Even when lying down, a sailor feels the sea. The body waits for the next roll, the next drop, the next strike. Sleep comes in pieces, and when sleep breaks often enough, fear finds more room to sit down. For passengers, if any were aboard, the experience could be worse because they had less to do and less understanding of what was normal. A working sailor could focus on tasks. A passenger might simply endure the motion, listen to the ship, and wonder whether each new sound was the sound everyone had been dreading. Seasickness added its own misery. Heavy rolling and pitching can make the strongest confidence drain away with surprising speed. Many noble thoughts about adventure have been revised beside a bucket. This may not sound heroic, but it is deeply human, and the Horn did not care whether someone had romantic expectations about the voyage. There is also the matter of direction and timing. Waves come in sets. There may be a few smaller waves, then a larger one. Experienced sailors learn to watch patterns, but in confused seas, patterns are harder to trust. A swell from the southwest, a wind sea from the west, reflected seas near land, currents shaping the surface, squalls adding bursts of local energy. All of this can make the sea state feel disorderly. A helmsman may ride one sequence well, then suddenly meet a crossing wave that throws the rhythm off. The ship's motion becomes less predictable, and unpredictability is tiring. The mind likes patterns because patterns allow preparation. Cape Horn often gave sailors patterns, then changed them. In deep ocean, a wave is mainly energy passing through water, not a mass of water travelling all the way across the sea. But when waves steepen and break, that distinction becomes less comforting. Breaking waves do throw water forward, and the force can be immense. The white water at the crest is air mixed with water, chaotic and powerful. A breaking sea striking a ship is not like a gentle lift. It is an impact. It can stop a vessel, twist it, or sweep across it. The shape of the hull, the angle of the wave, the speed of the ship, and the moment of impact all matter. In bad conditions, survival often depends on many such details lining up just well enough. The old square-rigged ships were especially vulnerable when they lost control. Their large rigs gave them power, but also windage, meaning surface area for the wind to push against. If waves damaged rigging or sails, the ship could become harder to handle. If masts came down, the fallen spars and lines could batter the hull or foul the rudder. In high seas, clearing wreckage was dangerous work. Men with axes and knives might have to cut away broken rigging while the ship rolled heavily and waves came aboard. The sea could turn one failure into several before the crew had time to breathe properly. Yet ships did survive, again and again, because seamanship was real. Crews learned how to heave to, run before a storm, lie under reduced canvas, manage drogues or sea anchors in some vessels, secure cargo, pump water, and keep watch. They learned the difference between discomfort and danger, though Cape Horn sometimes narrowed that difference to a very thin line. A good captain did not try to dominate the waves. He tried to manage the ship's relationship with them. That is a humbler and more accurate idea. At sea, especially near the Horn, control is never absolute. It is negotiated moment by moment. Modern science gives us numbers for what sailors once described through experience. Significant wave height, peak period, wave spectrum, current speed, wind speed, pressure. These measurements are useful and important. They help forecast danger, design ships, plan routes, and understand the climate system. But numbers can also flatten the imagination if we are not careful. A significant wave height of several meters does not mean every wave is that height. Some are smaller, some are larger. Individual waves can be much higher than the average. A forecast may say one thing, while the largest wave of the hour says something much more direct. For a sailor, the number matters, but so does the one wave that arrives at the wrong angle. Near Cape Horn, waves became part of the place's identity, because they represented the sea's physical scale. Wind is invisible, current is partly hidden, cold is felt through the body, but waves are seen. They give shape to danger. A large swell rising behind a ship can look like moving land. The trough between waves can feel like a valley. From the deck of a smaller vessel, the horizon may vanish behind water. This is why sailors reached for comparisons like hills, walls, or mountains. They were not trying to be literary. They were trying to describe the unsettling fact that the sea surface, which we imagine as flat, had become a landscape. And unlike land, this landscape does not stay put. That is the deepest discomfort. A mountain remains where it is. A wave comes toward you. The ship climbs one, falls from another, twists between two and waits for the next. There is no path to remember, no stable ridge, no safe hollow. The whole terrain is moving, and the sailor must move with it. Around Cape Horn, where wind, swell, current and cold combine, that moving terrain can become one of the sternest tests in ocean navigation. From here, the danger does not become simpler. The waves are enough to earn respect on their own, but they arrive in a world that is also cold, dim, wet, and often hard to see through. A ship may survive the height of the sea and still be troubled by fog, ice, darkness, and the slow stealing of warmth from hands and judgment. The Horn was not feared only for its dramatic moments, but for the quieter hazards that gathered around them, the ones that waited in poor visibility, in freezing spray, in the long hours when the body grew tired and the southern sky offered very little comfort. After the wind has filled the sky and the waves have risen into that hard southern motion, the dangers around Cape Horn do not stop with the obvious things. A wave can be seen, a gale can be heard. A ship's deck can tilt so sharply that everyone aboard becomes suddenly religious about handrails. But some of the most dangerous parts of this place are quieter. They do not always arrive with a great roar. They creep in. They reduce what a sailor can see, feel, judge and survive. Cold, fog, ice and darkness are not as dramatic in the imagination as a towering wave breaking over the bow, but around Cape Horn they could be just as deadly. Cold is the first of these quiet hazards, because cold changes everything. It changes the body. It changes the ship. It changes the speed at which mistakes become serious. On a mild sea in warm weather, a wet sleeve is irritating. Around Cape Horn, wet clothing can become a problem that slowly steals strength. Spray comes over the side, rain comes down, sleet can sting the face, gloves soak through, boots become heavy. A man working on deck may keep moving and feel almost warm for a little while, but once he stops, the chill moves in, quickly. The body has to spend energy simply keeping itself useful. That is energy no one has in unlimited supply. Cold water is worse. It is one thing to be cold on deck, where there is at least the ship beneath you and some chance of shelter below. It is another thing entirely to go into the sea. In the waters near Cape Horn, a person overboard is in immediate danger. Not in a general, distant, educational sort of danger, but in a very practical and urgent one. Cold water pulls heat from the body much faster than cold air. Hands lose strength. Breathing becomes difficult. Muscles stop obeying as they should. Even a strong swimmer can become weak quickly, and in heavy seas, the ship may not be able to turn easily or safely. The person in the water rises and falls among waves, appearing one moment and vanishing the next. A crew may know exactly where someone went over and still struggle to find them again. This is one reason sailors were so careful about moving on deck in bad weather, though careful is a relative word when the whole ship is being shoved around by the Southern Ocean. Lines were rigged. Men clipped or tied themselves when possible. Hands stayed on rails and rigging. Feet searched for grip. Still, no system was perfect. A wave did not need to be enormous to knock someone down if it arrived at the wrong time. A line could snap. A sail could flog. A block could swing. A person could slip. And once the sea had someone, the cold joined the waves in making rescue hard. Cold also worked on the ship itself. Wood swelled and strained. Metal fittings chilled. Ropes stiffened. Wet canvas became heavy. Blocks and pulleys became harder to handle. Everything that needed flexibility became less cooperative. A frozen or stiff rope is not just annoying, it slows work. It makes knots harder to tie and untie. It can jam when speed matters. In heavy weather, every delay has weight. A sail that should be reduced quickly may take longer to secure. A line that should run free may resist. A hatch that should close neatly may not. The cold does not have to break a ship in one grand gesture. It can simply make every task take more strength and more time. Below deck, cold had its own way of settling in. Old sailing ships were not comfortable places at the best of times. Around the Horn they could be wet, cramped, dim, and difficult to heat. Clothes did not dry easily. Bedding could feel damp. The smell of salt water, tar, wet wool, bilge, smoke, and tired people filled the air. Meals might be plain, if cooking was possible at all. A galley stove in rough seas is not a friendly domestic object. It is a hot metal problem surrounded by moving wood and hungry men. Even tea, that brave little solution to so many human troubles, becomes complicated when the cup keeps attempting escape. The cold also affected judgment. This is easy to overlook. We often imagine danger at sea as a matter of strength, but clear thinking is just as important. A tired, chilled sailor may move more slowly, react later, or misread a situation. A captain may still make decisions, but the whole crew's ability to carry them out depends on hands, eyes, balance, hearing, and stamina. When cold and exhaustion combine, small mistakes become easier. Around Cape Horn, small mistakes could join together. A missed order, a poorly secured line, a hatch left open, a wet deck crossed too quickly. None of these sounds grand. But at sea, disaster often enters through ordinary doors. Then comes fog, or more broadly, poor visibility. Fog has a way of making the world feel smaller, while making danger feel larger. A ship in clear weather can see the sea around it. The horizon gives space. Land can be identified. Waves can be watched. Clouds can be read. Another vessel may be spotted in time. In fog, rain, spray, or low cloud, that space disappears. The world shrinks to the length of the deck, the nearby water, and the next dim shape. The ship continues moving, but the eyes no longer receive enough information. That is deeply uncomfortable arrangement. Around Cape Horn, poor visibility could be caused by several things. Fog could drift in, rain could thicken, squalls could sweep across the water, spray could blow horizontally in strong wind, low cloud could cover the land, mist could wrap around the rocks. The result was the same. Sailors could not see enough, and in a place of rocky coasts, islands, shoals, and fast-changing weather, not seeing enough was dangerous. A ship needs to know where it is. It needs to know where the land is. It needs to know whether another danger is ahead. In modern times, radar, GPS, satellite navigation, and accurate charts help enormously. In the age of sail, a great deal depended on dead reckoning, celestial observations when the sky allowed, soundings where possible, and the judgment of people who had every reason to wish the fog would go bother someone else. Dead reckoning is a simple idea with difficult consequences. A navigator estimates a ship's current position based on its previous position, speed, direction, and time travelled. But wind, current, leeway, steering error, and waves all interfere. Around Cape Horn, where currents could be strong and wind could push a vessel sideways, uncertainty could grow. If the sky was hidden for days, it might be hard to take the observations needed to correct the estimate. A ship could believe it had more room than it did. It could believe it was farther from land. It could believe it had cleared a danger. The sea is not offended by incorrect beliefs. It simply allows them to continue until rock or weather provides a correction. Fog also changes sound. In poor visibility, sailors listened more carefully. Breakers on rocks might be heard before they were seen. A bell, a horn, a shout, or the cry of birds might carry oddly through the air. Sound in fog can deceive as well as help. It may seem closer or farther than it is. It may come from a direction that is hard to judge. A ship in fog is not blind exactly, but it is moving through a world with unreliable edges. That is tiring. Every watch becomes more tense. Every shape matters. A darker patch ahead may be a cloud, a wave, land, ice, or nothing at all. This is not good for the nerves, especially nerves that have already spent several days being introduced to freezing spray. Ice brought a different sort of fear. Around Cape Horn, sailors were not usually sailing through solid pack ice in the way polar explorers might, but icebergs and smaller pieces of ice could drift north from Antarctic waters through the Drake Passage. Large icebergs are dangerous because they can damage or sink a vessel in a collision. Smaller ice is dangerous because it may be harder to see, especially in darkness, fog, or rough seas. There is a word sailors use for small iceberg fragments: growlers. It is an excellent word because it sounds like something that should be avoided, preferably from a considerable distance. A growler may not rise high above the water, but ice is hard, and a ship striking it can suffer serious damage. The danger of ice is partly visual. A large berg in daylight may be seen from far away, though even then it can be difficult in poor weather. But ice does not always announce itself clearly. In fog, it may appear as a pale shape too late. In darkness, it may not be seen at all. In rough water, smaller ice can be hidden by waves. A sailor on lookout might stare into the cold air until his eyes watered, trying to separate foam, spray, cloud, and ice. Foam is white. Ice is white. Breaking waves are white. The sea enjoys this kind of unhelpful similarity. Ice also has mass below the surface. The visible part of an iceberg is only a fraction of the whole. That fact is so often repeated that it has become almost ordinary, but at sea it is not ordinary at all. It means the true size and shape of the hazard are hidden. The underwater portion may extend out in ways that are not obvious from above. A ship trying to pass close to ice may be closer to danger than it appears. Good seamanship keeps distance when possible, but Cape Horn and the Drake Passage did not always offer clean choices. Weather, wind, current and sea room all shaped what a vessel could do. For wooden ships, ice could be damaging. For iron and steel ships, it remained a serious threat. A hull is strong, but it is not magic. A sharp impact can open plates, damage frames, or create leaks. In cold water far from help, a leak is not a small inconvenience. It is a race between water entering and people removing it, repairing it, or finding some way to keep the ship afloat. Pumps, patches, collision mats, carpentry, muscle, and luck all had roles to play. Around Cape Horn, no one wanted to add ice damage to a list that might already include torn sails, strained rigging, exhausted crew, and a galley that had given up trying to behave like a kitchen. Then there is darkness. At high southern latitudes, the length of day changes greatly with the season. In summer, the days can be long. In winter, daylight is short. But darkness at sea is more than the absence of sun. It changes how fear works. In daylight, even bad weather has shape. You can see the wave coming. You can see the clouds moving. You can see the deck, the rigging, the land, the ice, or at least the trouble. At night, the sea becomes sound and motion. A wave lifts the ship from behind before anyone sees it clearly. Spray hits the face out of black air. The rigging hums above. The horizon may vanish. The water beside the hull is only a darker movement under darkness. Working a sailing ship at night in bad weather was hard anywhere. Around Cape Horn it could be brutal. Men had to climb, haul, reef, steer, and repair by lantern light, moonlight if they were lucky, or almost no light at all. Orders had to be heard through wind. Hands had to find the right lines. Feet had to find footholds on wet wood. A mistake made in daylight might be corrected quickly. A mistake made in darkness might not be noticed until it had grown larger. Night makes every task slower, and at sea slowness can be expensive. Darkness also hides land. This matters greatly near a cape, because the very thing that tells you where you are can also wreck you. In clear daylight, a coastline can be identified, measured and avoided. At night, especially in storm or fog, land may only reveal itself by sound, a darker shape, or the sudden sight of breaking water. For old sailors, being close to land in heavy weather was not comforting unless there was a known harbour and a safe way in. Otherwise, land was a hard edge. A lee shore in darkness was one of the worst situations a sailing ship could face. The wind pushes the vessel toward land. The waves follow. The ship struggles for sea room. The crew works to keep it off. Every minute matters. The lighthouses and navigation aids that later helped sailors were valuable, but even a light can be hidden by weather. Fog can swallow it. Rain can blur it. A ship can be too far away, or too close to another danger, or approaching from a bad angle. Modern navigation has reduced this uncertainty, but in the old days, the night around Cape Horn must have felt very large. The ship was a small moving place of lamps, voices and wet decks, surrounded by black sea and black sky. Beyond that, rock waited where rock always waits, silently and with great patience. There is another kind of darkness too, the darkness below deck during long bad weather. Not complete darkness perhaps, but dimness. Lamps swinging, shadows moving, the sound of water against the hull, men trying to sleep in wet clothes or under damp blankets, someone coughing, someone checking a leak, someone bracing a pot, the ship moving constantly. In such conditions, time can become strange. A long night feels longer. A watch feels longer. A storm that lasts through several nights begins to feel as if the world has reduced itself to noise, motion, and waiting. This is not romantic, but it is real. Fear at sea often has no grand speech attached to it. It is simply a person lying awake and listening to the hull. Cold, fog, ice and darkness also work together. Each one made the others worse. Cold reduced strength and reaction time. Fog reduced visibility. Ice made collision more dangerous. Darkness reduced the chance of spotting ice or land. Heavy weather made rescue harder. A tired crew made mistakes more likely. One hazard alone might be manageable. Together they form the quiet ambushes of the Horn. Not the single blow everyone remembers, but the set of conditions that narrow choices and reduce safety until the ship is moving through a much smaller margin than anyone would like. This is why the stories of Cape Horn are not only stories of huge waves and howling wind, they are also stories of waiting for daylight, of standing watch in poor visibility, of feeling the cold through wet gloves, of hearing breakers and not knowing how close they are, of seeing a pale mass ahead and realizing it is ice, of trying to judge distance when fog removes the horizon, of keeping the ship off a lee shore through a night that seems to have no interest in ending. These are not always the moments that appear in paintings, because paintings prefer clear drama. But sailors remembered them. The natural world around Cape Horn is not cruel in a human sense. It is not planning anything. The fog does not intend to hide rocks. The cold does not intend to numb fingers. The ice does not intend to open hulls. Darkness does not intend to frighten tired people. These things simply exist, and ships entering the region have to deal with them. That may be the most unsettling part. The danger is not personal. It is indifferent. A storm does not care whether a sailor is brave. Ice does not care whether the cargo is valuable. Fog does not care whether the captain is experienced. The sea gives no special treatment for confidence, reputation, or a very convincing hat. And yet people continued to pass through. They prepared, watched, learned, and endured. They wore what protection they had. They kept lookouts, they took soundings, they checked the glass, they waited for breaks in the weather. They used every bit of knowledge available. Sometimes it was enough, sometimes it was not. Cape Horn became famous because the line between enough and not enough could be very thin there. In the modern era, the quiet ambushes remain, but the tools are better. Ships have radar to see through darkness and some weather. GPS gives position with a precision old navigators would have found almost unbelievable. Satellite forecasts show storms before they arrive. Better clothing protects crews from cold. Modern hulls are stronger. Emergency systems can call for help. But the basic facts still matter. Cold water is still cold. Fog still reduces visibility. Ice is still hard. Darkness still makes work more difficult. Technology improves the odds, but it does not remove the ocean. There is a useful humility in that. Cape Horn teaches that danger is not always loud. Sometimes the worst risks are the ones that quietly reduce your ability to respond. A sailor can prepare for a big wave because it is visible for a moment. But fatigue, cold, poor visibility, and long darkness work slowly. They wear down the crew before the crisis comes. Then, when something does happen, everyone has less strength left to meet it. This is true in many difficult places, but around Cape Horn the lesson was written in salt water, ice, and long southern nights. So as we picture a ship moving through those waters, it is worth seeing more than the famous storm scene. Picture also the lookout squinting into fog, the helmsman with cold hands on the wheel, the captain trying to judge whether the ship has enough sea room, the men below trying to rest while the hull shudders, the cook waiting for a safer moment to make something warm, the sudden shout from deck, the pale shape in the water, the sound of breakers hidden by rain, the long wait for dawn. These were the quiet dangers that made the Horn more than a rough passage. They made it a test of endurance, attention, and patience. The wind and waves could strike hard, but cold, fog, ice, and darkness changed the conditions in which every decision had to be made. They made the sailor's world smaller, slower, and less forgiving. And in that smaller world, surrounded by weather and water at the bottom of the Americas, many ships found out just how little room there was between a successful rounding and a place in the long grim memory of the sea. By now, the fear of Cape Horn begins to make a practical kind of sense. The wind is strong, the waves are large, the water is cold, the visibility can vanish, ice can drift in from the south. Land can be close enough to wreck a ship and too hostile to offer comfort. But there is another reason sailors feared these waters, and it is heavier than weather. It is memory. Cape Horn became feared because ships did not always come back from it. Men left ports with cargo, letters, tools, hopes, debts, jokes, bad tempers, good boots, and the usual private thoughts people carry with them. Then they sailed south, and sometimes the ocean kept them. A ship might be expected in Valparaiso, San Francisco, Sydney, Liverpool, or some other far port, and it would simply not arrive. Weeks would pass, then months. A rumour might come from another vessel. A piece of wreckage might wash ashore, a logbook might survive, or a lifeboat, or nothing at all. For the families waiting at home, the sea could be cruel in its silence. It did not always explain what had happened. It often just closed over the answer. This is how a place becomes a graveyard in the human mind. Not only because wrecks are counted, though the numbers are grim enough, but because absence gathers around the name. Cape Horn was not merely difficult. It was a place where people vanished into weather, water, and distance. The old estimates are often repeated. Hundreds of ships lost, thousands of sailors dead. The exact figures vary depending on what area is counted and which centuries are included, but the point is not only arithmetic. The point is that the losses were numerous enough to become part of maritime culture. Sailors did not need a museum plaque to know the warning. The warning was passed from mouth to mouth, from captain to apprentice, from logbook to forecastle, from one tired watch to the next. The phrase ship graveyard can sound dramatic, almost like something invented for a poster with lightning on it. But around Cape Horn it came from real patterns of danger. A ship could be dismasted by wind. It could be driven onto a lee shore. It could strike hidden rock in fog. It could be damaged by sleet. It could be overwhelmed by breaking seas. It could lose steerage. It could spring leaks. It could be pushed too far south, or held for weeks in weather that wore down the crew. In many cases, the final disaster was not one clean event. It was a chain of problems. A storm tears a sail. The ship loses speed. The crew struggles to repair it. The wind shifts. The vessel drifts closer to land. Night falls. The sea rises. A pump fails. A man is injured. Another line parts. Then, by morning, what began as bad weather has become wreckage. That is one of the frightening things about the Horn. It did not need to destroy a vessel immediately. It could reduce it. A ship might be strong at the start of the passage, well found, well crewed, and commanded by an experienced captain. Then came days of heavy sea. Rigging strained. Canvas split. Men lost sleep. Food became harder to prepare. Water got into places it should not. A small leak became a larger worry. Cold made hands slow. Fog made navigation uncertain. The vessel might still be afloat, still moving, still fighting, but less capable than it had been. Cape Horn was feared because it tested not only strength, but remaining strength. A wreck at sea is not like a wreck on land. On land, disaster often leaves a site that can be visited. Broken beams, stones, metal, marks, witnesses. At sea, evidence moves. Wood floats away. Cargo sinks. Bodies are lost. Papers dissolve. The storm passes and the water looks like water again. This gives maritime loss a special sadness. The place of death may be known only approximately. A ship may have gone down somewhere south of the Horn, or west of it, or in the Drake Passage, or near one of the outer islands, somewhere in a huge moving area of cold water. That word somewhere can be very hard. It is not a grave with a name, it is a direction. For sailors, such losses became part of the mental landscape before they reached the physical one. A young crewman sailing south for the first time would have heard stories. Some were likely exaggerated because sailors are human, and human beings have never been able to leave a good frightening story entirely alone. But many stories did not need much help. A ship rolled over. A man washed from the deck. A captain tried for weeks and had to turn back. A vessel rounded the Horn but lost half her canvas. Another was seen once in distress and never again. These were not fairy tales. They were occupational memory. They taught respect, caution, and sometimes dread. Legends at sea often grow from practical fear. The ocean is too large and too unpredictable for people not to create meanings around it. Sailors watched the sky, read the water, listened to old rules, and carried superstitions alongside skill. Some would not begin a voyage on certain days. Some watched birds as omens. Some had beliefs about whistling for wind, or not whistling for wind, which is exactly the kind of disagreement one expects from people trying to negotiate with the atmosphere. Albatrosses in particular carried deep meaning in maritime culture. They were great birds of the southern seas, able to glide for long distances over waves that made ships struggle. To sailors, they could seem like spirits of the open ocean, watchers of rough water, or symbols of souls lost at sea. At Cape Horn, the albatross became especially fitting. Today the memorial on Hornos Island uses the form of an albatross to honour the sailors who died attempting the passage. It is a simple idea, and that is why it works. A bird made into a sign of the dead, a shape of flight in a place of wrecks. The monument does not calm the wind or change the sea, but it gives memory a place to stand. That matters. Humans need places to put grief, especially when the actual graves are scattered across water too deep and too wide to mark. The sailors themselves had customs tied to rounding the Horn. In some traditions, a sailor who had rounded Cape Horn under sail earned certain rights or symbols, such as wearing a gold hoop earring or putting one foot on the table in particular old seafaring lore. The details varied, and not every custom was universal, but the idea behind them was clear. Rounding the Horn meant you had done something difficult. It was a credential written not on paper, but in experience. A sailor who had been there had earned a certain look from other sailors, not applause exactly. Sailors are not always generous with applause, more a nod. A recognition that this person had met one of the hard places and returned. That recognition also separated the living from the dead. Every successful rounding carried a shadow of those who had failed. When sailors poured drink into the sea, toasted Neptune or remembered lost shipmates, it was not only ceremony, it was acknowledgement. We passed, and others did not. We are still here, and the water has taken many. There is a humility in that kind of celebration. It is not the cheerful victory of a sports match. It is the quieter relief of people who understand that survival is not always proof of superiority. Sometimes it is skill. Sometimes it is judgment. Sometimes it is a strong ship. Sometimes it is luck arriving at exactly the right moment, slightly late perhaps, but still welcome. The fear of shipwreck around Cape Horn was also shaped by the coastline itself. Tierra del Fuego and the islands around the Horn are not gentle in bad weather. There are channels, rocks, shoals, cliffs, and exposed shores. A disabled vessel could be driven toward land with very little chance of escape. In a strong onshore wind, even a good ship might struggle to claw away from danger. Anchoring was not always possible. Launching boats could be impossible in surf. And if survivors reached shore, they were not stepping onto a friendly beach with a warm inn and someone offering soup. They might find cold, wet, remote land with rough terrain and little immediate help. Survival after wrecking was another ordeal entirely. There were also wrecks that became stories because of what they revealed about courage. The Horn did not only produce tales of death, it produced tales of endurance, command, and unlikely survival. One famous example connected with the wider Cape Horn region is Mary Ann Patten aboard the clipper Neptune's car in 1856. When her husband, the captain, became seriously ill near Cape Horn, she took command under extreme pressure while pregnant, dealing with storms, danger, and crew conflict, and eventually brought the ship safely to San Francisco. Her story reminds us that the fear of the Horn was not only about physical conditions, it was also about leadership under strain, about trust aboard ship, about whether people could still act wisely when the sea had removed every easy option. Stories like that matter because they show why Cape Horn remained in the imagination even after the practical need for the route declined. The place became a stage for human character. Some ships failed because the weather was overwhelming. Some survived because the crew was skilled. Some survived because someone made a hard decision at the right time. Some were lost despite every good decision. That last part is important. We like stories where bravery guarantees survival, but the sea has never signed such an agreement. A brave sailor can drown. A careful captain can lose a ship. A strong hull can meet a stronger wave. Cape Horn's reputation was built partly on that unfairness. In the age of sail, the fear was intensified by communication, or rather, by the lack of it. Today, a vessel in trouble may send a distress signal, share its position, and be tracked. Help may still be far away in the Southern Ocean, but at least the wider world can know something is wrong. In earlier centuries, a ship beyond sight of land and other vessels was almost completely alone. If it was damaged, no message went out. If it sank, no alert appeared. Families and owners might wait with no information until hope thinned out. This made every dangerous route feel more ominous. To go around Cape Horn was to pass through a stretch where the world's attention could not easily follow. Insurance companies, merchants, and ship owners understood the risk in financial terms. Cargo might be lost. Ships represented huge investments. Delays cost money. Damage cost money. A captain might be pressured to make a fast passage, but speed and safety were often in tension. The California gold rush, the nitrate trade, grain routes, wool, guano, and many other cargoes helped fill the old sea lanes with urgent commerce. A ship could not simply wait forever for perfect weather. Perfect weather around the Horn is the sort of thing one should not schedule a birthday around. Captains had to choose when to attempt the passage, how much risk to accept and when to turn away. The attempt itself could become legendary. Captain William Bligh and HMS Bounty, before the famous mutiny, tried to round Cape Horn in 1788 on the way to Tahiti. The ship struggled against severe weather for weeks, and finally abandoned the westward attempt, taking the longer route eastward around the Cape of Good Hope instead. That choice says a great deal. Even for a disciplined naval vessel under a determined commander, the Horn could simply refuse progress. Not literally, of course. The Cape was not making a decision, but from the deck of a ship beaten back again and again, it must have felt very much like refusal. Another often mentioned case is the German full-rigged ship Susanna, whose westward struggle around Cape Horn in 1905 became famous for its length and hardship. Accounts describe a passage from 50 degrees south in the Atlantic to 50 degrees south in the Pacific taking 99 days, with many crew members sick or injured by the end. The details of such stories are repeated because they capture the full nature of the Cape Horn ordeal. Not one storm, not one wave, but time itself turned difficult. Day after day of hard weather, progress measured slowly, human bodies wearing down, a ship still afloat, but at great cost. That kind of endurance produced a special fear because it challenged morale. Fear is not always sharp. Sometimes it is dull and repeated. The first gale is frightening. The second is exhausting. The third becomes discouraging. After weeks of difficulty, even strong people begin to feel the weight of uncertainty. Will the wind ever shift? Will the ship hold together? Are we gaining ground or losing it? How many more days can the crew work like this? The Horn's graveyard reputation was built not just from wrecks that happened quickly, but from voyages that stretched human endurance until failure became easier. It is also worth remembering that not every death near the Horn came from dramatic sinking. Sailors died from being swept overboard, crushed by gear, falling from rigging, exposure, illness, infection, or injuries made worse by distance from medical care. A ship might reach port with missing men and a battered crew, officially successful but privately marked. A rounding could be counted as completed, while the people aboard knew exactly what it had cost. Maritime history often records ships and captains more clearly than ordinary sailors, but the dead of Cape Horn were largely working men, many of them young, many far from home, whose names may survive only in crew lists, if at all. This is another reason the Albatross Memorial feels appropriate. It honours not only famous captains and famous ships, but the countless less remembered sailors whose labour carried the age of sail, the men who reefed canvas in sleet, the boys who learned knots with numb fingers, the cooks, carpenters, mates, apprentices, able seamen, and ordinary hands. The people who did not write books, did not become legends, and did not have portraits painted. They are part of the Cape Horn story because the passage was not rounded by ships alone. It was rounded by bodies doing hard work in bad weather. Legends also helped sailors deal with powerlessness. At sea, a person can do everything right and still be small. Superstition is sometimes mocked from land, but aboard a ship it has a different function. It gives shape to uncertainty. If one believes certain birds, winds, words or rituals carry meaning, then the world feels a little less random. It may not make the ship safer in any scientific sense, but it gives fear somewhere to go. A sailor might joke about omens and still watch them. He might laugh at old rules and still avoid breaking them. The ocean encourages this kind of double thinking. Practical skill in one hand, old belief in the other, and both hands gripping tightly when the deck lurches. Cape Horn gathered these beliefs because it was a threshold. Many cultures create rituals around thresholds: doors, crossings, departures, arrivals. Rounding the Horn was a maritime threshold of the largest kind. On one side, one ocean. On the other, another ocean. Behind, weeks or months of voyage. Ahead, more uncertainty. A successful passage deserved a mark. A failed one became a warning. The Horn was a place sailors approached with work, caution and stories already in their heads, and stories can become protective in their own way. A frightening story told before a voyage may encourage care. It may make a young sailor tie himself more securely, check a line twice, listen more closely to an older hand, or understand why the captain orders sail reduced before the danger feels obvious. Fear is not always bad. Proper fear keeps people alive. The wrong kind of fear freezes the body and clouds the mind, but the right kind sharpens attention. Cape Horn demanded that kind of fear. Not panic, respect. Even today, with charts, engines, weather routing and satellite navigation, sailors speak of the Horn with a tone that is different from ordinary destinations. Modern racing yachts round it as part of around-the-world races, and their crews often describe it as a major psychological milestone. Expedition ships may visit in suitable weather, and passengers may stand on deck looking at the famous cape in relative comfort. Yet the old feeling remains. Part of it is history. Part of it is the knowledge that the weather can still change. Part of it is the simple fact that some places keep their seriousness no matter how many modern tools we bring. A calm day at Cape Horn can almost feel misleading. The sky may open, the water may settle, birds may glide. The cape may appear not as a monster, but as a lonely piece of land under cloud and light. A visitor might wonder how such a place became so feared. Then the wind rises, or the forecast changes, or someone remembers the wrecks, and the answer returns. Dangerous places are not dangerous every minute. They are dangerous because when conditions turn, they turn with consequence. The graveyard passage is therefore not only a list of wrecks, it is a long record of the meeting between human ambition and a severe environment. It includes greed, courage, trade, exploration, desperation, pride, bad luck, good judgment, poor judgment, endurance, and grief. Ships went there because the world's routes demanded it. Sailors feared it because they knew what had happened before, and once enough ships had been lost, the Horn no longer needed to prove itself to every new crew. Its name carried the proof. Still, fear did not stop sailors from going. That is one of the strange facts at the heart of maritime history. People feared Cape Horn and went anyway, not because they were foolish, though some may have been, not because they enjoyed suffering, though sailors have been known to develop suspiciously complicated relationships with discomfort. They went because trade required it, duty required it, ambition required it, or the voyage simply led that way. The fear was part of the preparation. It travelled with them down the Atlantic, around the cold edge of the world, and into the Pacific if they were fortunate. So when we call Cape Horn a graveyard, we should hear more than danger. We should hear names missing from records, families waiting for letters, captains making hard choices, crews hauling wet lines in darkness, ships turning back after weeks of effort, and survivors who carried the memory for the rest of their lives. We should see the albatross not as decoration, but as a symbol chosen because ordinary words were not enough. And we should understand that the legends around the Horn were not separate from reality. They were reality remembered, repeated, and shaped into warning. The old sailors knew something that remains true in every difficult passage. A place does not become legendary because it is impossible. It becomes legendary because it is possible, but only just. Cape Horn could be rounded. Thousands did it. But the sea made sure no one forgot the terms. Skill mattered. Timing mattered. The ship mattered. The crew mattered. Luck mattered. And when all of those held together, a vessel might pass from one ocean to the next, battered but afloat, carrying its people onward with one more hard story added to the long history of the Horn. From there, the question becomes not only why sailors feared these waters, but how any of them managed to face them, work through them, and survive the rounding at all. To round Cape Horn was never simply to sail past a piece of land. It was to bring a ship, a crew, and a long chain of decisions through one of the hardest sea passages on Earth, then come out the other side with enough mast, hull, rope, canvas, strength, and luck still holding together. The word rounding sounds almost too smooth for it. It makes the whole thing seem like turning a corner in a quiet street, perhaps while carrying a paper bag of groceries and hoping the eggs are all right. But around Cape Horn, the corner was made of wind, cold water, hard rock, and waves with a very poor sense of personal space. For old sailing ships, survival began long before the Cape appeared. It began in preparation. A vessel bound for the Horn had to be ready for heavy weather before the heavy weather arrived. Rigging had to be inspected. Sails had to be repaired. Spare canvas, lines, blocks, tools, and pumps had to be in order. Cargo had to be stowed carefully, because cargo that shifts in a storm can threaten the whole ship. Barrels, crates, coal, grain, wool, timber, machinery, or whatever else the vessel carried had to stay where it belonged. A ship at sea is a moving structure, and if the inside begins moving in the wrong way, the outside soon has new problems. The crew had to be prepared too, though sailors were not machines and could not be tightened like bolts. They needed food, water, rest when possible, and a working rhythm. Watches had to be arranged so that enough men were available when weather changed. Experienced hands watched the younger ones. Younger hands learned quickly, because Cape Horn was not a patient schoolmaster. The sea did not offer gentle quizzes before the final exam. It preferred to begin with freezing spray, a torn sail, and someone shouting an order that needed to be understood immediately. Courage was necessary, but courage alone was not enough. This is important. Stories often make survival sound like a matter of brave hearts and clenched jaws, and there was certainly plenty of both. But a brave fool at sea is still a fool, only wetter. Rounding the Horn required judgment. It required timing. It required understanding how much sail the ship could carry, how the hull was behaving, whether the wind was rising or easing, where the current might be setting the vessel, how much sea room remained, and whether the crew had enough strength for the next task. Courage might get a sailor up into the rigging. Skill brought him back down alive. A captain approaching Cape Horn had to think in layers. There was the visible weather, the wind and sea right now. There was the likely weather, suggested by the barometer, the clouds, the swell, the season and experience. There was the ship's condition, which might be strong at the start but damaged after days of punishment. There was the crew's condition, which was just as important. Men who had been working wet and cold for long periods could not be treated as if they were fresh. Orders that looked good on paper might fail if the crew was too exhausted to carry them out safely. The best captains understood that seamanship included people. A ship is not only sailed by canvas and rope, it is sailed by tired hands. The first major question was often when to attempt the passage. Weather windows mattered, though old sailors did not have satellite maps or modern forecasts showing storm systems from above. They had instruments, signs, and experience. The barometer was watched carefully. A falling glass could warn of worsening weather. Clouds told their own stories. The shape and direction of the swell could suggest distant storms. Birds, air temperature, visibility, and the feel of the wind all became part of the reading. A good seaman was a patient observer. Around the Horn, noticing small changes could make a large difference. Once committed, the ship had to keep moving without being overpowered. This balance was at the heart of survival under sail. A vessel needed enough sail to maintain steerage and make progress. If it carried too much, the wind could heel it dangerously. Tear canvas, strain masts, or damage rigging. If it carried too little, the ship might wallow, lose control, or be unable to work away from danger. The right amount of sail was never a fixed answer. It changed with the wind, the sea, the direction of travel, the condition of the gear, and the aim of the moment. Sometimes the goal was speed. Sometimes it was simply to keep the ship in a safe attitude to the waves. Sometimes it was to survive the next hour with the fewest broken things. Reefing sail was one of the essential tasks. To reef is to reduce the area of a sail, making it smaller so it can be carried in stronger wind. That sounds tidy enough until we remember how it was done on old square-rigged ships. Sailors climbed the rigging, moved out along yards high above the deck, and wrestled heavy canvas while the ship rolled and plunged. The sail might be wet, stiff, and thrashing. The wind might be loud enough to tear words away. The deck below might rise and fall like an argument. A sailor stood on a foot rope, leaned over the yard, gathered canvas, tied reef points, and trusted his hands, his balance, and the men beside him. This was not a symbolic act of bravery. It was cold, repetitive, dangerous labour, and it had to be done correctly. The order to reef early could save a ship. The order to reef too late could put men into the rigging when conditions had already become extreme. This was one of the difficult judgments. Carrying sail a little longer might gain miles before the next blow, but if the blow arrived hard and sudden, the ship could be caught over-canvassed. Around Cape Horn, where weather could change quickly, captains had to decide how much risk progress was worth. Every mile gained westward against the wind mattered, but every broken spar mattered too. A ship with damaged rigging might lose far more time later than it gained by pressing too hard now. The Horn punished impatience, though it did so without making any official announcement. Tacking around Cape Horn, especially westward, was another test. A sailing ship working against the prevailing westerlies had to zigzag, sailing at angles to the wind. Each tack required coordination. The helm was put over, sails shifted, yards were braced. Lines were hauled. Timing mattered. In rough seas, a failed tack could leave the ship in irons, pointed into the wind with sails flapping and little control. In heavy weather near dangerous water, that was not a position anyone wanted. Wearing ship, turning the stern through the wind instead of the bow, could be safer in some conditions but took more sea room. Sea room was precious. The captain needed space to manoeuvre, and Cape Horn was not always generous about offering it. Keeping away from a lee shore was one of the great survival priorities. A lee shore means land downwind, where the wind is blowing the ship toward rocks, surf, or cliffs. In strong weather, even a capable vessel might struggle to claw off. If sails or steering gear were damaged, the danger grew quickly. Around the Horn, land could appear through fog or rain with very little warning. The ship needed enough room to drift, turn, and recover from setbacks. Open water could be frightening, but it was often safer than being too close to shore. This is one of the odd truths of seamanship. The empty sea may feel hostile, but the hard land can be worse. Helming in heavy seas required its own kind of skill. The person at the wheel, or at the tiller on smaller vessels, had to feel the ship's movement and respond to waves. Steering was not only about compass direction. It was about keeping the vessel properly angled to the sea, preventing dangerous broaches, avoiding being caught beam on by breaking waves, and maintaining enough control for the sails to work. A good helmsman became part of the ship's nervous system. He felt pressure through the wheel, watched the crests, sensed when the stern lifted, and corrected before a small swing became a large one. It was tiring work, and in cold spray it could become a test of endurance as much as skill. Below deck, survival had quieter forms. Pumps had to be kept working. Ships leaked, especially after heavy pounding. A little water in the bilge was normal. Too much was not. Men might pump for hours, sometimes in terrible conditions, removing water that the sea kept trying to lend them without being asked. Carpenters and officers checked for damage. Hatches had to be secured. Gear had to be lashed. Galley fires had to be managed or put out if conditions became too violent. Food still mattered. Warm food mattered even more. A crew cannot work forever on fear and damp biscuits, though maritime history suggests people made some very serious attempts. Survival also depended on discipline. In a storm, panic wastes effort. Orders must be followed. People must know their duties. A loose line has to be handled. A damaged sail has to be secured. A hatch has to be closed. A man injured on deck has to be moved or protected. Everyone cannot simply run toward the most frightening sound at once, even if the sound is making an excellent argument. Ships survived because crews acted as organised groups under pressure. The best seamanship was often not glamorous. It was a practised habit. This line, this knot, this station, this watch, this repair, this order. There was also the skill of knowing when not to fight. This may be one of the most important parts of rounding the Horn. Human pride enjoys the idea of pushing through. The sea is less impressed. Sometimes the right decision was to heave to, setting the sails and rudder so the ship made little headway and rode out the weather at a safer angle. Sometimes the right decision was to run before the storm, keeping the waves astern and giving up a desired course for survival. Sometimes it was to turn back, or at least stop trying to force a westward gain until conditions changed. A captain who could surrender a few miles at the right time might save the ship. Stubbornness and courage look similar from a distance, but at sea the difference can be fatal. For crews, fear had to be managed, not denied. Sailors were not immune to fear because they were sailors. They knew more about what could go wrong, which may have made fear sharper. A landsman might hear a strange creak and worry vaguely. An experienced sailor might hear the same sound and know exactly which spar, stay, or fastening was complaining. Knowledge does not always calm the mind. Sometimes it gives the mind better details, but trained fear becomes attention. A frightened sailor who keeps working, clips on, takes orders, checks knots, and watches the next wave is far more useful than a confident man who ignores danger because he finds it inconvenient. Sleep was another survival tool, though the horn often made it difficult. Watches rotated, but in heavy weather all hands might be called repeatedly. A man off watch could crawl into a bunk, still wet, still cold, and try to sleep while the ship rolled. His boots might be near him, his oilskins might not dry. A crash above could bring him out again. Over days, sleep debt built up. This affected judgment, strength, and mood. A captain had to preserve the crew where possible, send men below when they could be spared, feed them when possible, keep them warm enough to function. This may sound basic, but in a storm basic, things become strategy. Navigation was another form of survival. Around Cape Horn, knowing the ship's position could be difficult in poor visibility. Before modern electronic navigation, sailors relied on celestial observations when the sky allowed. Dead reckoning, compass courses, logs, charts, soundings, and experience. Cloud and storm could prevent sightings of the sun or stars. Current and wind could push the ship away from its expected track. The navigator had to estimate, correct, and allow for uncertainty. A good navigator did not simply ask, "Where are we?" He also asked, "How wrong might we be?" That second question can save lives. If there is uncertainty, give the land more room. If the current may be setting you toward danger, act early. Cape Horn did not forgive exact confidence based on approximate knowledge. The crew also needed to protect the ship from internal failure. A vessel in heavy weather is under constant strain. Blocks, shackles, masts, yards, shrouds, stays, sails, rudder, hull seams, cargo lashings and deck fittings all carry loads. A weak point can fail suddenly. Preventive work mattered. Checking chafe on lines, adding extra lashings, securing boats, clearing drains, covering hatches and keeping pumps ready were all part of survival. None of this sounds heroic in the way paintings like heroism to look, but a properly lashed spar may save a life more effectively than a dramatic speech, and with much less wind resistance. Injuries had to be treated with whatever knowledge and supplies were available. A fall, a broken limb, a deep cut, frostbite, infection or crushing injury could become serious far from port. The ship's medicine chest was limited. The ship's surgeon, if there was one, was valuable. Many merchant vessels had no trained doctor. Officers and crew did what they could. The best treatment was avoiding injury in the first place, which is simple advice and very difficult to follow on a wet deck in the furious 50s. Safety aboard was not modern safety. There were no comfortable harness systems in the old sense, no helicopters waiting nearby, no instant evacuation. A sailor's first emergency service was the person next to him. Food and morale were closely connected. Hot meals were difficult in rough seas, but when possible they helped enormously. Warm drink, soup, stew, or anything that put heat into the body could lift spirits. A crew that eats functions better. A crew that believes the ship is still being managed well functions better too. Captains and mates had to carry authority without wasting words. In bad weather, confidence spreads, and so does doubt. A calm order can steady people. A careless panic can do the opposite. Around the Horn, leadership was not only navigation and sail plan. It was the ability to keep people working when every sense told them the world had become unreasonable. The courage of ordinary sailors deserves special attention. Captains are remembered because command leaves records. Ships are remembered because names are painted on sterns and written in ledgers. But rounding Cape Horn happened through the labour of the crew. Men hauled lines until their hands were raw. They went aloft when the rigging was iced or slick. They stood lookout in darkness. They pumped water. They steered through long watches. They obeyed orders that were frightening but necessary. They watched friends injured or lost and then kept working because the ship still needed them. This is a hard kind of courage. Not the single dramatic leap, but the repeated decision to do the next necessary thing. There were also women who faced the Horn, though maritime history has often remembered them less clearly. Some travelled as passengers or captains' wives. Some, like Mary Ann Patten in the wider Cape Horn tradition, became part of the story of command and survival under extreme pressure. Her case is often remembered because it breaks the usual picture of who held authority at sea. But many women endured difficult passages without becoming famous. They faced seasickness, fear, cold, confinement, childbirth risks, illness, and uncertainty aboard ships built around male labour and commercial purpose. The Horn tested everyone it carried, not only those written into official narratives. For ships that survived the rounding, the moment of passing Cape Horn could carry a strange mixture of relief and caution. The Cape might be sighted through cloud. It might be passed at a distance. It might not be seen at all if weather was poor. A crew could know from navigation that the Horn was astern, but the sea might still be dangerous. This is another reason not to treat the rounding as a neat victory scene. Passing the Cape did not instantly make everything safe. The ship still had to clear the region, repair damage, make progress, and continue the voyage. But psychologically, the rounding mattered. One of the great obstacles had been met. The route had turned. The Pacific or Atlantic lay ahead, depending on direction. Men who had been tense for weeks could allow themselves a little more breath. This is where the identity of the Cape Horner came from. A sailor who had rounded the Horn under sail had passed through one of the Old World's hardest tests. Maritime associations later preserved this identity, and traditions grew around it. Whether marked by stories, certificates, earrings, tattoos, jokes, or the simple respect of other sailors, the meaning was the same. This person had been there, not read about it, not watched it from a cosy room while tea behaved itself, been there, had felt the ship lift under southern waves, heard the wind in the rigging, and watched the hard end of South America pass by. Modern sailors who round Cape Horn face a different world, but not an easy one. Racing yachts, expedition vessels and private boats have weather forecasts, GPS, satellite communications, survival suits, stronger materials and better rescue systems. Yet the underlying environment remains severe. A modern crew still plans around weather windows, they still reef, they still manage fatigue, they still respect waves, current, cold, and the distance from immediate help. Technology changes the tools, but not the need for judgment. In fact, modern tools can create a new danger if they make people overconfident. A forecast is not a shield. A GPS position does not calm a breaking sea. A satellite phone does not make a cold hand tie a knot correctly. For small modern yachts, rounding the Horn can still be a major achievement. Crews prepare carefully, often waiting in southern ports such as Ushuaia or Puerto Williams for conditions that give them a reasonable chance. They study forecasts, inspect gear, secure everything, and choose the moment. Even then, the passage demands flexibility. If the weather turns, plans change. If gear fails, priorities shift. The old rule remains. The sea decides what kind of day it is, and the sailor decides how wisely to respond. What makes rounding the Horn so compelling is that it reveals the practical meaning of courage. Courage is not pretending the place is safe. It is understanding the danger clearly and still doing the work properly. It is clipping on before crossing the deck. It is reducing sail early, though pride might prefer speed. It is turning back when turning back is the right answer. It is trusting the crew, checking the gear, reading the sky, and accepting that survival at sea is a partnership between skill and humility. Cape Horn did not reward those who treated it as a trophy before they had earned passage. It rewarded, when it rewarded at all, attention. Watch the barometer. Watch the clouds. Watch the swell. Watch the crew. Watch the land. Watch the gear. Watch yourself too, because tired minds make confident mistakes. The sailors who survived did not conquer the Horn in any literal sense. No one conquers weather. They passed through it. They worked with what they were given. They gave ground when necessary and took it when possible. They kept the ship alive. There is something deeply human in that. Most of us will never reef a topsail in sleet, or steer a vessel through the Drake Passage at night, which is probably best for everyone's laundry. But we understand difficult passages. We understand the need to keep going carefully when conditions are not ideal. We understand that preparation matters, that help is not always nearby, that fear can be useful, and that endurance is often made from many small actions rather than one grand gesture. Cape Horn became famous because it showed these truths in their most physical form: a ship, a crew, a hostile sea, and a narrow chance to get through. And once a vessel did get through, once the worst of the Horn lay behind and the crew could begin setting things right, the story did not end. It travelled with them. It entered their speech, their posture, their private memory. It became something told in ports, written in logs, carried in scars, marked in traditions, and passed down to people who had never felt that southern wind themselves. That is why Cape Horn remains more than a navigational landmark. It is a test that became a legend, and a legend that still rests on real seamanship, real fear, and real survival, leaving us with the question of why this lonely, weather-beaten place still holds such power over the imagination long after most ships found easier ways between the oceans. Cape Horn still haunts the imagination because it is not only a place on a map, it is a place where the map seems to run out of comfort. It sits at the far southern edge of South America, on Hornos Island, small enough to be missed by someone looking at the whole globe too quickly, and yet large enough in human memory to fill books, logbooks, sailors' tales, paintings, expedition plans, and quiet warnings passed from one generation to another. Some places become famous because they are beautiful, some because they are rich, some because battles were fought there or cities rose there. Cape Horn became famous because people tried to pass it, and the sea made sure they remembered. There is something about an edge that holds the human mind. We understand edges instinctively. The edge of a cliff, the edge of a storm, the edge of sleep, the edge of what a person can endure before the body and mind ask, very politely at first, then rather less politely, whether this was truly necessary. Cape Horn belongs to that family of edges. It is not the end of the planet, of course. Antarctica lies farther south. The ocean continues. The world does not stop because a map label becomes dramatic. But for sailors, especially in the age of sail, Cape Horn felt like a hard boundary between known effort and severe trial. It still feels that way because the story is simple enough to understand and serious enough to respect. A ship wants to move from one ocean to another. The route leads south. The temperature falls, the sky changes, the westerlies begin to press harder, the swell grows. The crew works more carefully. The captain watches the glass and the clouds. Then comes the Horn, not as a gate with pillars, not as a line painted across the water, but as a region of force. Wind, wave, current, cold, poor visibility, rock, and distance from help all gather into one test. It is not difficult to see why the name lasted. Modern people are surrounded by safe versions of danger. We watch storms through windows. We follow ship routes on screens. We see satellite images of weather systems from above, where even the largest storm looks almost tidy. A spiral of cloud, a swirl of white, a shape we can zoom in and out of with 2 fingers while sitting somewhere dry, perhaps with a biscuit nearby that has never once been threatened by the Southern Ocean. Cape Horn resists that neatness. The more we learn about it, the more the old fear makes sense. The science explains the danger, but it does not make the place feel small. That may be one reason it still haunts us. Cape Horn reminds us that knowledge and control are not the same thing. We can know why the winds are strong. We can understand long fetch, ocean currents, cold water, and the Drake Passage. We can forecast storms better than any sailor from the age of sail could have imagined. We can build stronger ships, wear better clothing, use GPS, radio, radar, and satellite communications. All of that matters. All of it saves lives. But none of it changes the basic fact that the sea there is large, cold, and capable of becoming dangerous very quickly. Knowledge gives us better choices. It does not make the ocean ask permission. There is also a strong pull in the old human stories. A ship rounding Cape Horn gives the imagination something clear to hold. A crew far from home, a captain making decisions in bad weather, men aloft in wet rigging, waves breaking over the deck, a coast hidden in mist, a line snapping in the dark, a ship pushing westward and being driven back again. These are physical images. They do not require complicated explanation. Anyone can understand what it means to be tired, cold, afraid, and still required to work. Anyone can understand the feeling of needing to keep going because stopping is not an option. Cape Horn takes that feeling and places it on a huge stage of water and wind. The word haunts is useful here, not because the place needs ghosts in the ordinary sense, though sailors have always been good at keeping a few nearby, but because Cape Horn stays with the mind after the facts are known. It does not become less interesting once explained. Some places do. Once you know the trick, the mystery fades. But Cape Horn is different. Knowing that strong westerlies blow around the Southern Ocean makes the fear clearer. Knowing that huge waves can build across long, open distances makes the old accounts more believable. Knowing that frigid water, fog, ice and rocky shoals made mistakes deadly does not reduce the legend. It gives the legend bones. The Albatross Memorial on Hornos Island adds to that feeling. It gives memory a shape. The albatross is an important bird in sea tradition because it belongs so naturally to the open ocean. It can glide for long distances over rough water while ships struggle below. To sailors, that kind of bird was never just a bird. It was a companion, a sign, sometimes an omen, sometimes a reminder that life could move through those harsh waters with grace. A memorial shaped around the albatross makes sense because the dead of Cape Horn were not all buried in marked graves. Many were lost to water, weather and distance. The monument gives their memories somewhere to rest, even if their bodies never did. This is part of the lasting power of the Horn. It is both a place of survival and a place of loss. If it were only a graveyard, it would be tragic. If it were only an achievement, it might become a trophy. But it is both at once. Sailors died there. Sailors survived there. Some ships were lost. Others came through battered but proud. Some crews were broken by the passage. Others earned the old title of Cape Horner and carried it for the rest of their lives. The place contains both warning and honour. That combination is hard to forget. There is a difference between conquering and passing. Cape Horn teaches that difference clearly. People often say explorers conquered mountains, deserts, oceans or polar regions, but that word has always been a little too confident. A mountain remains, a desert remains, the sea remains. The person passes through, if allowed by conditions, preparation, skill and luck. Cape Horn was never conquered in any lasting sense. Ships rounded it. Sailors survived it. Some did so many times. But the next storm still came. The next wave still rose. The next crew still had to make its own choices. The Horn did not become safer because someone had once been brave there. That is why the place still matters even in an age when most people will never need to sail around it for practical reasons. Its meaning has moved from necessity into symbol, but not an empty symbol. It stands for the hard passage that cannot be rushed, the corner that must be taken carefully, the environment that demands humility, the work that must continue even when comfort has vanished. It is easy to turn that into grand language, but the truth is simpler. Cape Horn reminds us that some journeys are difficult because the conditions are difficult, and wishing them easier does not change the weather. The wider region also haunts the imagination because it is not only severe but alive. The Cabo de Hornos area is part of a sub-Antarctic world of forests, tundra, marine life, birds, channels, rain, mosses, and cold ecosystems shaped by wind and water. This matters because it prevents us from seeing the place only as a human obstacle. The Horn was dangerous to sailors, yes, but it was not created as a test for sailors. It existed before their ships and continues after them. Birds nest there. Plants cling to the land. Marine animals move through the water. Rain falls whether or not anyone has written a log entry about it. The place has its own life, and that life does not need human drama to be important. Still, humans bring drama wherever they go, especially when there is a deadline and bad weather. Cape Horn became part of literature, sea songs, adventure writing, naval history, racing culture, and the private mythology of sailors because it condensed so many maritime fears into one name. Fear of storm, fear of wreck, fear of being far from help, fear of failing the shipmates who depend on you, fear of the unknown water ahead, fear of the known water behind. And beneath all of that, the old fear that nature may be larger than our plans, which is a useful thing to remember, though perhaps not right before trying to sleep. At the same time, Cape Horn also carries a kind of attraction. People are drawn to difficult places not only because they are dangerous, but because they reveal something. A calm harbour shows one part of seamanship. Cape Horn shows another. It reveals preparation, patience, leadership, endurance, and judgment under pressure. It reveals how quickly a machine built by humans can become small in the wrong conditions. It reveals how much trust is needed aboard a vessel. The person at the helm trusts the rig. The person in the rigging trusts the line. The captain trusts the crew trusts the captain. Everyone trusts the ship, and the ship trusts, if a ship can be said to trust anything, that its people will not ask more of it than it can give. Modern sailors who round Cape Horn often describe it as a milestone even when they have advanced equipment and careful forecasts. That tells us something. The challenge has changed, but the name still carries weight. A racing skipper rounding the Horn alone, a yacht crew waiting for a weather window, an expedition vessel passing in the rough conditions, a passenger looking out at the famous headland under low cloud. All of them are connected in some way to the older story. They may not be reefing square sails by lantern light. They may not be eating hardtack below deck while the ship leaks into its boots. But they are still in the same part of the world, under the same broad wind belts, near the same cold passage between South America and Antarctica. The old seriousness has not left. It is also possible that Cape Horn haunts us because it is honest. Many modern risks are hidden behind systems. Electricity works until it does not. Supply chains move quietly until they fail. Weather alerts arrive as coloured maps and messages. The machinery of ordinary life protects us from noticing how much depends on timing, maintenance, and good conditions. Cape Horn is not hidden. It shows the risk plainly. There is the water, there is the wind, there is the ship, there is the rock, there is the cold. What happens next depends on what people do and what the weather allows. There is a strange clarity in that, and after all the history, science, and story, there remains the image of the Cape itself, not always storm-lashed, not always dramatic. Sometimes it may be seen under a quiet sky, with birds moving above and the sea breathing heavily but not angrily. That calmness does not erase the reputation. In fact, it may deepen it. A feared place does not need to perform constantly. Cape Horn does not need to roar every hour to prove what it is. Its history is already written into the minds of those who know it. A calm day there is not a contradiction. It is a pause. So why do sailors still speak of Cape Horn with respect? Because respect is memory made useful. It is the mind saying, others have passed here before, and not all returned. It is the body saying, clip on, check the line, shorten sail early, watch the glass, trust the forecast, but watch the sky. It is the old knowledge that fear, when kept in the right shape, can protect life. Cape Horn does not ask for panic. Panic is clumsy. It asks for attention. And why does it still hold the imagination of those of us who may never go there? Because it gives us a clear story about limits. The limit of land, the limit of old ships, the limit of human strength, the limit of confidence, but also the reach of skill, courage, and endurance. It shows both sides. We are small. We are capable. We are vulnerable. We prepare. We misjudge. We survive. We remember. Few places say all of that so clearly without saying anything at all. And now, dear listener, we have travelled as far south as this quiet voyage needs to go. We began with the name itself, Cape Horn, a small rocky point carrying a very large reputation. We looked at where it sits, at the lower edge of South America, beside the Drake Passage and the cold waters that connect great oceans. We followed the winds that circle the southern hemisphere and build the long swells sailors feared. We watched the waves rise, not as flat lines on a forecast, but as moving weight beneath a ship. We spent time with the quieter dangers too, the cold, fog, ice and darkness that narrowed the margin for every decision. We remembered the wrecks, the legends, the sailors lost, and the sailors who came through and carried the horn in their bones for the rest of their lives. And perhaps that is the lasting answer. Cape Horn still haunts the imagination, because it is real in every way that matters. Real rock, real weather, real water, real loss, real courage, real memory. It is not a monster from a story, though stories have gathered around it. It is not a myth, though it has become legendary. It is a place where the planet's shape, motion and weather meet human ambition, and the meeting has never been entirely comfortable. So as you settle a little deeper now, far from those cold southern seas, let the image of the horn soften rather than sharpen. No need to feel the spray, no need to brace against the rail. Let the old ships pass at a safe distance in the mind. Let the wind stay outside the room. Let the albatross turn slowly over the grey water and then glide away into the low cloud. You're not on watch tonight. There are no sails to shorten, no pumps to work, no hidden rocks to avoid, no captain calling for another hand at the wheel. If this journey through one of the world's most feared sea passages brought you a little calm, a little curiosity, or simply something steady to listen to at the end of the day, I'd be ever so grateful if you liked the video, subscribed, and shared this quiet space with someone else who enjoys learning while the world slows down. Cape Horn will remain where it is, at the edge of the map, with its wind, its birds, its memorial, and its long memory of sailors. But here, for now, the sea is only a story, the storm is only a sound in the distance, and the night can carry you somewhere gentler. Sleep well, fellow traveller, wherever you are listening from tonight. May your waters be calm, your room be warm, and your dreams keep a safe and comfortable distance from Cape Horn.